definitely got. Wonderful. Got it. Okay. Great. So welcome, folks. Welcome, members of the Vermont Climate Council. Welcome, observers, others who are joining us today. This is a straight up Zoom meeting. That means we all have the same capacity to mute and unmute ourselves. So we'll just have to be respectful of that. And thanks, everyone. As we often say, if you're a member of the Climate Council, we encourage you to have your camera on, particularly when we're looking at each other like this, as opposed to looking at a document. If you're observing our meeting, we welcome you to observe. Please keep your camera off until we get to public comment periods, which we will have in today's meeting. With that, I'll turn it over to your chair, Secretary Young. Suzanne Young, please go ahead.
Thank you, David, and welcome everybody. It's good to see you. Beautiful sunny fall day. Today is September 28th, 2021. It is a meeting of the full Vermont Climate Council. We have about 3 hours scheduled, and it's a pretty packed schedule. The first item will be the approval of the September 14, 2020 minutes. I will leave it to Jane to let us know. Jane, will there be a just transitions reflection today, as is on the draft agenda?
We'll have a reflection. It won't be like what we normally do, but yes, we'll have a reflection.
Perfect. We will then go through the decision-making proposal that has been reviewed by the steering committee for discussion and action by the full council. The Ag and Ecosystem will discuss with us their draft pathways, strategies, and actions. And we will take a break, and then we will have a presentation of the strategies and actions proposed by the Rural Resilience Subcommittee. We'll have a discussion and need to take action on and approve a definition for cost effectiveness and feasibility. And then we are going to have further discussion on decision making by the council. And we will then open this up for some updates on the public stakeholder meetings and equity consultant, and then public comments. So it's, like I say, a packed agenda, but if there is anybody who would like to discuss the agenda and discuss any changes or amendments, please speak up now, and David can take over from here.
Thanks so much, Secretary Young. Great. So any questions, concerns on what we're going to do today in our agenda? Anything people need to bring up right now? Okay. All right. And Sue Minter, I saw your text that you're having some connectivity problems. I hope you can solve those. Thanks for hanging in there with that. Okay, great. So let's get into it. The first thing we need to do, as typical, is just approve our previous minutes. They are hyperlinked into our agenda, which I've been pasting a couple times into the chat. I'll paste the sort of location of all these documents again into the chat for folks who are just just joining the meeting. So go ahead, let's take a moment, hyperlink in through there, remind yourself about those minutes, and we'll give a sec for anybody who needs some more time or wants to raise a concern about them. Would anybody like some more time to look at these minutes or review them? Okay, any concerns about them? Okay, so without hearing any concerns, we'll treat those as approved. Thanks everyone for that. Okay, so what we typically do at the top of these meetings, if you remember, each of our last meetings for the last 4 months is we've had a just transitions reflection moment. And for a variety of reasons, we don't have a great speaker or somebody lined up this time. And so we're not going to have that kind of just transitions reflection moment today. However, it's an opportunity for us to think about what we do want as we're moving into our final sets of meetings prior to our December 1st deadline. And so what we wanted to do, and I say we, Jane and I in particular, and Marion, wanted to get some feedback from you all about what would be most powerful in these sort of just transition reflection moments. To give you a sense, next meeting, we're going to have the equity facilitator, Kaya Morris, come in and talk about her process and how that's going. And so that's what we're going to do next meeting is really remind ourselves what's going on, and she can get some feedback from all of you as she's leaning into her process. And then the following meeting, we're going to do some reflections amongst you as counselors about how that process is going with Kaya and in your subcommittees as you're starting to do the just transitions reflections in that exercise of applying that criteria in the matrix, et cetera. But then we've got a couple meetings going forward as we're really moving into the decision-making of content where we don't have something lined up right now. And we do have some ideas that we wanted to get your feedback on right now. Some of those ideas include, for instance, having Senator Rahm come in and presenting on the EJ bill that's being considered. Another is to get the person at ANR who's doing the diversity and equity inclusion work there. Her name's Carla Raimundi, and get her to speak a little bit what's going on internally in the state and in ANR around these issues. And so those are the kinds of options that we have there. So, so we would welcome just now as a moment to say, what would be powerful for you as a council for those meetings we have coming between now and December, if we want to make this space at the front of every meeting. There's one more thing I wanted to mention, and that is we saw in the steering committee and then in the Just Transitions subcommittee meeting last week, there was a suggestion about organizations, for instance, 350.org has gone out and spoken to a lot of folks across the state about climate recently. Other organizations, Capstone's doing it, other organizations are doing it, and Just Transitions subcommittee is considering how to maybe do a consolidated meeting on these organizations that are doing their own outreach, just like we're out there in the public with our public meetings now. So that's another thing that likely will happen at Just Transition subcommittee space, but somehow could be woven up to our council level as well. So let me stop talking and say, the question on the table for us right now is, do any of you as counselors have input about how to use this time wisely when we create this space for the Just Transitions reflection at the top of your meetings? What reflections do you have and reactions to some of the options I'm putting on the table? Joey, you want to go ahead?
Sure. I'd want to think about it more, but I appreciate the invitation, and I think it would be helpful to have Senator Rahm Hinsdale and Carla potentially both present. I think an environmental, just understanding what's already happening and what the an environmental, like a specific environmental justice policy could mean in service of our work and just the broader work related to advancing equity in Vermont could be very helpful. And I also think it would be very helpful in understanding what's happening and or what gaps we have when it relates to sort of data tracking, mapping, definitions, and I think that would be incredibly helpful. So I would very much welcome their participation, either collectively or independently.
Thanks, Joey. That's helpful. Rob? Go ahead, Rob.
Rich.
Oh, Rich, sorry. My head is like somewhere else.
I like all the suggestions I've heard so far, so this isn't in opposition to that at all. But I think it would be useful for us to reflect, or to have the occasion to reflect, on the inequity of the status quo outside of Vermont. That is, global impacts of climate change have very inequitable effects in a lot of places around the world. And we haven't actually been discussing those very much. I think we're aware of it. That's what lies behind the GWSA in the first place. But I think it would be good to take a moment to think about why we're doing this in the first place.
Thanks, Rich. Thanks so much. Anything else that would be particularly powerful, you think, for us, for you all as a council? Okay, great. Okay. Thanks, everyone. So with that, I think we'll transition to the next pieces of our agenda. And we appreciate that feedback. What we wanted to do before we get going on the meat of our meeting today, the meat of our meeting is to look at the ag and ecosystems, emerging strategies and actions, and to look at rural resilience, emerging strategies and actions. We're going to really spend some time on that today. That's the bulk of what we're doing. Before we do that, there's been some work done on the decision-making protocol. And this came up in our last council meeting because there were some questions about decision-making and a little bit of frustration expressed. We put some words on paper. It's hyperlinked in the agenda, so you all have that. It's in that link that's in the chat. And I'll show that document in just a sec. But I wanted to give a little background on this. What we'd like to do now with you all as the council is just to make sure you're aware of what's in that document. And then we're going to go ahead and try it out today, right? And when we get to the end of the day, we're going to come back and see, how did that work? How are we feeling about this as we're getting into the final throes of getting towards December 1st? And we're not going to try to approve this or give official council blessing. We're going to try to do that in a subsequent meeting. The steering committee is also going to meet tomorrow morning to look at this and see how it went today and see how we feel about it. But we do want to be conscious about what we're putting on the table. And then we're going to come back as a council later, whether it's your next meeting or the following, and really land this and be very clear about how we're handling decision-making on the council. Okay. The document that you see is one that reflects input from the steering committee, but there's still some puzzles in it for the steering committee. They're not 100%, they haven't signed off on it at all. They've given input and we think we're heading in the right direction. So that's the status of where this document is right now. Let me go ahead and share my screen with it because I want to just walk through for a second what's in this document. And apologies, I don't have a nice, pretty looking PowerPoint to do this. Let's just use the document itself. If you give me 1 second, I'll make sure I'm sharing the right screen. Okay, so this is the document that's attached to the agenda. It was circulated at the end of last week. And I really hope folks are getting a chance to read things. From the coordination side of things, Jane and Marion and myself, we're really trying to get documents earlier and earlier to you all so you have time to read because we know it's not fair to drop something on your lap the night before. So we're really trying to back up those days so you have time to read these things. So what's this document? This is what it does. First of all, it cuts and pastes from the sort of roadmap document that you all approved back in March, right? When we were just getting going, we knew we need a roadmap and we talked about decision-making in it. And all this italicized text is just cut and paste from there. At the bottom of this italicized text, we talked about the value of the consensus building approach and the fact that in statute, you also have a majority voting protocol. What we've tried to do is say, well, what does all this mean in practice, particularly as we're getting into this end game of an initial draft document on December 1st? And there's basically two really big ideas I want to put out there as we're getting into today's meeting. One is you all and we all need a clear decision request. We need to everyone be clear what we're being asked to quote unquote agree to. And today you'll see we're going to do two kinds of agreements. For the ag and ecosystem and rural resilience, all we need to agree on is a set of notes that we're sending back to the subcommittees, right? That's what we need to do. And I'll be taking some notes in real time in addition to the very detailed notes that are happening. And I'll share those with folks and say, this feels like the summary feedback that needs to go to the subcommittee. Are we getting this right? And we'll look at that on the screen for a second and make sure we're on board, that we're capturing the big ideas for the subcommittees in real time. We're also today going to try to make some decision on the content of our initial December 1 report, right? Because we're going to look at these definitions for feasibility and cost effectiveness. There, we actually are agreeing on a document with definitions and language. That's different, right? So we need to know what we're agreeing to. If we're making any changes in real time, again, I'll do some writing and we'll look at those in real time so we know what we're agreeing to. So we get to try both today to see how they feel. The second thing this document does is say, well, hang on a second. What does it mean to work by consensus? When do we activate our majority voting protocol if we need to activate it? And here, the document lays out a sequence that says we really want to exhaust in the time we have every opportunity to weave in people's concerns into what we're our package, right? We're going to do everything we can with creative problem solving and everything. And we know we're under a time limitation. So we're going to be using some real-time polling in the chat, some very easy real-time polling. Remember, we did that a couple of weeks ago, a couple of meetings ago, you know, like a 1, 2, 3, how am I feeling about this? We're going to be doing that more and more to show where the temperature of the group on a particular issue. And then we're going to inviting people to let their concerns to be memorialized in the minutes. And if that still isn't enough, we're going to, if there's time, which there may or may not be, allow folks to go and try to solve that quickly in a small group. And if there isn't time and we're done, we'll need to activate our voting protocol. Okay, so this is all in this document here. And the spirit of it, again, is we know our recommendations, that when they come out as an initial, or it's not even recommendations, when our initial climate action plan comes out on December 1st, it will be stronger and have a faster road to implementation if it is consensus based and we're all on board with it. We also know we have very little time and we need to be able to move expeditiously when we need to. And there in statute is a voting protocol. So that's what's going on. Any quick questions about this? Again, we're not agreeing or disagreeing to this right now. We are just making sure everybody's aware of what it is. We're going to use it today. We're going to reflect at the end of the day, and then we're going to confirm this at a subsequent meeting to really make sure we're clear on our voting and our overall decision-making protocol. So I'm going to drop screen just so we can see each other for a second. I'm happy to put it back up. Anything that's not clear in this decision-making protocol that we want to clarify now before we get going today? Liz, go ahead, please.
Thanks. First of all, just as someone who saw an earlier version on the steering committee meeting, thank you for the updates and the clarity in this. I think it's a really good attempt to put down something complicated in a way we can digest. So that's really appreciated. The question I have regarding how it will actually work concerns that part toward the bottom right above where you had the majority vote information about if there's, I can't remember, I think it says lack of detail in a proposal, a counselor can bring that up. And I guess just functionally, I'm a little bit uncertain how that will work, given, first of all, the level of detail that we're putting into the report generally. And, you know, many of our pathways, strategies, and actions are broad, purposefully and needfully. And then second, even if there were something that kind of clearly qualified for that provision, how it would actually work in practice.
Yeah. So the final point is easier for me to address. I think there are it's a very good question about what level of detail is enough for this council to feel they can say, yep, that's appropriate. I feel comfortable with what we have and that going forward into our initial plan. In terms of how it will work in practice, somebody can raise up that as a request, and then we can act on that request. So that's how it would work in practice. And just quick, Liz, you want to follow up on that?
Yeah,
And I'll
just
grab Chad quick.
super quick. I saw it when I read the proposal over the weekend. I saw it easily applying, or relatively easily applying, to something like the consultant reports that we've received, which are themselves meant to be quite detailed. And if there's something about it, as we already, I think, discussed and handled when it came to the GHG emissions report, for example, something that needs further fleshing out or some concern. So I see it there. I'm less clear how it will work for actual proposals as is phrased here. So
Yeah,
that's
fair enough.
specifically where my concern is.
Yeah, and I think, Liz, what I'll take back is let's really play that out and see if we can add some more detail about how it works in practice. Chad, go ahead, please.
Thank you, David, and I'm echoing Liz's appreciation for both the work that went into this document, as well as all the work of the steering committee. I was going to basically say the same thing that Liz just did. In viewing this for the first time, I guess I do have concern about that clause, given the fact that a lot of these strategies and actions are going to be somewhat high level. I think about on cross sector, the concept of going to 100% renewable energy standard, but kind of leaving some of the details out, just because we won't have time to, address every last issue, won't have time to, essentially dot every I and cross every T. So it seems like this this provision could be, I would be afraid that it could be used to slow things down and really take a number of items off the table that just are not going to be able to be fleshed out the way we'd like in the next couple of months here.
Thanks. That's helpful, Chad. I think Jared is next, then June.
Thanks, David. Agree that this helps move us forward overall. Also agree with the specific concerns that Liz and Chad and Lauren and Kelly and others are adding in the chat. I do think at a minimum, one of the things that we would want to do, as Kelly just said in the chat, I agree with, is make it clear that if we're talking about consensus, it would be consensus to table the motion, not to not table the motion. Otherwise, it would present a bar that would be far too high to have things move forward. I think that the burden should be to table something, not to not table something if it's coming forward as a recommendation through the process of the subcommittees.
Thanks, Jared.
I think also just really briefly that when we talked about this in the steering committee, my recollection was that we were having a broad discussion about there may be some broad pathways or strategies or actions that are kind of more prospective, that the technology may not exist, or we need to do additional data collection or analysis, and we may want to point to the possibility to add more detail in future plan revisions or in future plans. But that to me feels very different than tabling a recommendation that I think, as others have said, and I agree, nothing is going to have all the detail that will eventually be necessary to implement as policy and programs in this plan.
Thanks, Jared. Yeah, that's helpful. Commissioner Attorney, go ahead, please.
Thank you. First, I want to express my sincere admiration for this document and its thoughtfulness. In my career, I have always preferred consensus decision-making. In my career, I've spent the bulk of the time in a context where consensus decision-making was not the point of the process. So I agree that I could convict myself of being a creature of non-consensus based decision-making. And so it's refreshing to be part of this community thought process. Concerns that I have are this: we are pressed for time, so our decisions should not be made in haste. They do need to be made clearly, and I worry that we are very invested in achieving consensus when, given the number of perspectives we have here, I question whether we achieve genuine consensus when we aim for it. The statute, as I understand it, based on the final bullet under the section on section 2, I think. I can't identify it here quickly, but it's the subsection that we've been discussing that deals with for those who have concerns and then significant concerns. But the third bullet there, no, I'm sorry, the bullet on majority
Pull it back
voting
up. I'll pull it back up.
has a phrase in the second line that says this is outlined in the statute, which I take to mean that the statute provides for a majority vote.
Yeah.
I will go back and read the statute. But if that's the case, then very respectfully, I wonder if we're being a little ginger in using the statutorily designated process for making decisions. With those observations, returning to the first of the 4 sub-bullet points above, I see where we distinguish between for those who have concerns and then counselors whose concerns are more significant. And it's not clear to me how we're going to make judgments about what constitutes a simple concern and what constitutes a significant concern. I'm also not sure I understand what is meant by we will invite them to step aside and allow the proposal to move forward. What does it mean to step aside? Does that mean that I'm recusing myself? Does it mean that others are recusing me from voting? I don't understand. So maybe a little clarification could help. And then finally, having very recently been a member who expressed concerns about a particular issue that we were very intent on achieving consensus on, I can say that there's a considerable amount of pressure that comes to bear in this consensus process. And so I think it would be wise to make very clear here that if a person feels strongly enough about their view, that person ought to be charged with the work of explaining their dissent, meaning writing it so that it can be recorded. In my experience and my professional judgment, dissent should be welcome. Dissent can well prove to be the corrective down the road. It is very rare that any question of policy or philosophy or law for that matter is so black and white that dissent is not capable of informing second generation and third generation thinking. In my particular example, I did not feel strongly enough about the dispute that was underway about the scoring card to where I was willing to invest further energy into detailing a dissent. I also felt that at this early stage in our process, it was best to try to conform to what appeared to be majority thinking on the point. But if something comes up in our decisional process, whether it is in the consensus-based deliberations or majority vote realm, it's not hard for me to see that people will have to make judgments just as I had to make about whether to agree or disagree. And I think we ought to have a clear rule that when somebody chooses to disagree, that person is also agreeing to author the nature of their dissent. That's all I have.
Thanks, June. That's great. That's really helpful. Secretary Moore, go ahead, please.
I just wanted to offer my sense of the reason for the options, and I think I actually suggested the one about tabling, was trying to give alternatives to people's need to outright oppose, understanding that the desired approach of the council, as in our initial operating principles, was to try to reach consensus, and welcome the feedback that may not hit the mark, and agree that given the time available to us, having a lot of details is probably unlikely for the number of strategies and actions that are likely to be brought forward. But at the same time, I think there are ones where there will probably be broad agreement, and there are ones where there will be more of a devil in the details. And it was trying to create an opportunity to not to leave space for the council to build that out. We have to deliver an updated climate action plan at least once every 4 years, but I don't think there's anything that prevents us from providing an updated climate action plan even 6 months after the initial adoption. And so just, want to make sure that we fully avail ourselves of the paths that are available to try to reach agreement on as many actions as possible.
Okay, thanks. That's a helpful clarification. Iris?
I wanted to first echo the concerns around the lack of details clause, but I also wanted to bring up the fact that designees are going to be treated as counselors in the subcommittee voting process. And I think that goes, not only I have concerns about it, but I also think it sort of goes against statute, because the statute says that there should be a secretary or designee, and currently the Secretary of Natural Resources has two designees on the different subcommittees, and therefore sort of has 3 votes in this process. So I just wanted to bring up a concern around that.
Thanks, Iris. Okay. Yeah, and I didn't signal this last part of this around the subcommittees. And again, this is something that we put in our document back in March. And the key there is around, it's up here in this part of the document, honestly, about how decision-making by subcommittees, right? That they're trying to seek consensus. And if they can't be resolved, members of the subcommittee will determine what, council members of the subcommittee will determine what is forwarded to the council, which can include supported, and you can also include the things that had less support. So I guess, Secretary Moore, did you want to mention something about this and Iris's concern?
Yeah, I think you flagged it, David. Frankly, the Agency of Natural Resources has an incredible stake in all of this work. I don't see that it's realistic to think we could do it without Agency of Natural Resources active participation in all of the subcommittees. It certainly wasn't set up in a way to have my voice or the agency's voice garner more weight. And I think the clauses you pointed to above, David, leave room for those actions and strategies to come forward to the council, where effectively every counselor only has 1 vote and action to be taken accordingly. I think it's I believe A&R staff have played an integral role in all 3 committees that they're serving on. And I think it's unfair to not let each of those individuals participate in the subcommittee process to the fullest extent.
Okay, thanks. Commissioner Attorney?
Along those lines, I categorically reject the proposition. It's very clear that there are 23 council members. It's very clear that no binding action of this council will be taken on the basis of any other vote besides the vote of those 23 members. Secretary Young is the only vote representing the Agency of Natural Resources. I have no concerns on this score whatsoever.
Right. Yeah, Secretary Moore, yeah. Okay. So that's valuable feedback. I think we need to sort of let this sit for a little bit, do our meeting today, see how it feels, come back at the end of the meeting, test it one more time. And on the specific issue that we just ended the conversation on, might I suggest that we have a small group conversation on the back end of this meeting and see if we can address those concerns offline and then bring it back to the full council with anything we need to say on that. Okay. Thank you everyone for that input. I think that's really helpful. Let's see how it goes. Okay. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is hear from Ag and Ecosystems. And as I mentioned, our goal here is to listen to what the subcommittee has to say, react, and provide some consolidated feedback that they take back into their subcommittee as they're doing the work. We know that subcommittees haven't done the full analysis on the 5 foundational criteria, the prioritization, the just transitions work, all that hasn't fully happened, right? So there's work to be done, and yet it's really important for us to have visibility at the council level about where this is headed in the packages of strategies and actions that are on the table for discussion. Okay, so let me turn it over to co-chairs of Ag and Ecosystems. I'm not sure how you're going to structure your presentation, and I'll leave it over to you. So Billy, Abby, take it away, please.
Billy, can you share our PowerPoint? Hello, everybody. How shall I say this? We are going to do the best that we can to provide information regarding where we are at currently. I think I will begin our presentation here today by saying that, yeah, I think we're good on this. Next slide. Apologies also, I have a beeping fire smoke alarm in the background, so that's fun. Our group here is our group. I think you are all aware of this at this point as well. Next slide. And so what we've been engaged in since July 26th, I just wanted to allude to a little bit, is, the refining and synthesizing of our strategies and actions. We were able to put together 3 stakeholder events with a ton of support from ANR and AAFM and stakeholder groups to do that. And it gave us really valuable information in addition to being really well attended. And I think just helping us to, it's not entirely clear to me yet how we're going to integrate the information we received there, but it was incredibly valuable information that we did receive there. And it is our intention to try to encapsulate it somehow into the how we're moving forward. And then the other thing that we've been working through a lot in our subcommittee, and this is where I think just the makeup of our subcommittee has created a bit of a different approach to process or different results at the end. But we've been working to elevate and move through some of the tension issues that come up when you're trying to develop strategies and actions within a very diverse group of stakeholders trying to address an extremely broad sector, right? The natural resource sector, natural and working land sector is quite enormous in the breadth of information that we're having to work across. And so our strategies are kind of all over the place. And so trying to just manage that has been quite a task in and of itself. But so how Billy and I have decided to approach today, and Billy can jump in at any point, we're going to go through and show you our pathways with the strategies that go alongside them, and maybe throwing in a few illustrative actions. That is so obnoxious, I'm sorry. Alongside those to give you a sample of where the actions are at. But I guess what I want to say is that our group has been very focused on achieving consensus around what we're putting forward and how we're putting it forward. And so we still have quite a lot of work to do, but this is our best attempt to sort of land you where we are. We have provided the matrix as it stands to you. And certainly I'm more hoping that today's time can go into folks raising up what has come up as potential concerns for them regarding
kind of where we're at currently. So with that, next slide. I'm going to let Billy take over if he's okay with that.
Okay, and the only thing I would add, Abby, to that introduction is that, we have a work plan in place to try to finalize our matrix of actions in the next week to week and a half over the course of 2 subcommittee meetings, and then take those into the prioritization and equity screening process. So, we've made some progress on the list of action items that were shared with the council last week. As hopefully you've seen and reviewed, it's quite extensive. So we're not going to pretend to try to hit on even a majority of those today. I think ultimately many of those will be consolidated or screened into a more prioritized and consolidated manner, but really hope that if there's anything that caught your eye on that list that you would like to raise with us, either in support or with questions or concerns, that we use the time to do that. We also have the last slide of our presentation is a list of topics where we still have some active and ongoing conversations amongst the subcommittee, which we want to highlight for you. So just know that that's coming. And I think we'll try to go through this pretty quickly, Abby, so that we can just reserve time for the council to share their own thoughts. So these are the 7 pathways that we developed through our subcommittee work. They focus on sequestration, adaptation, emissions, the viability of the working and natural landscape, the economies that are critical for helping owners and managers of our farm or forest land maintain those lands in active agricultural and forestry use, broader land use trends that pull in policy planning, land use regulation, the use of other types of land uses like energy generation across our landscape, and then a piece focusing on education and especially how we make sure that those who are working in these working enterprise sectors of our landscape have the information they need to be successful in a climate resilient future. I'm probably not going to read all these, but the sequestration pathway is looking primarily on ways that we can use our landscape to continue and expand the carbon that is sequestered and stored in it. There's a number of agricultural practices that we are going to recommend as action items to maintain and increase that level of storage and sequestration. There's actions that we are recommending around different existing programs that help support farm and forest properties through tax incentives and things of that nature to adjust the management objectives of those programs to increase the sequestration of the landscape, and then other sorts of market-based solutions that can hopefully increase both the carbon sequestration and storage and provide income streams for landowners. The second pathway focuses on adaptation. And this is where we're making recommendations for actions to make our landscape more resilient and adaptive into the future, understanding that the climate will change. So making sure that we have healthy forests, healthy lakes, healthy ponds, healthy ecosystem that can adapt and be resilient in the face of climate change. There's some overlap here with rural resilience. If you look at our actions, where there are certainly a number of actions and strategies that also provide adaptation and resilience to the more of the developed part of the state. Again, the viability pathway, this is really trying to make sure that the markets and the producers are strong, that are really the backbone of Vermont being largely an undeveloped state in a high percentage of agricultural and forested properties. We've got an emissions pathway that really focuses on the actual emissions from the sectors, the ag and forestry sector. So this isn't what the land can do, but more what managers and landowners can do in their practices to reduce their carbon footprint, which we know is an important part of the goal of the act. Coming back to that economic piece, really can't stress how important our group feels a solid ag and forestry economies are in the state to help maintain the over 80% of forested land that is privately owned. It's really the backbone to our climate future, and making sure that there is a workforce that can maintain those markets, and that there's a general support for these industries as they transition into a climate future is an important focus of our work. The land use pathway is a significant one. Again, this gets into planning, regulatory pieces that we can speak more to later, but this is where some of the kind of larger and more outstanding issues of debate are for our group. There is a large focus on expanding land conservation efforts in the state, as long as other tax policies and regulatory tools to ensure that we have land use patterns and development that are resilient, adaptive for our climate future when we anticipate an increase in population, and also help to mitigate emissions through smart growth and other practices. Then finally, there's a role for education in all this work, making sure that environmental education begins and is rooted at all age levels, and brings in an awareness of our working landscape, which is becoming a little bit separated in a lot of parts of the state where those traditional connections are less strong, and just ensuring that the appreciation for the work that farmers, forest landowners, and other land managers do in the interest of climate is well known by Vermonters. And then Abby, I don't know if you want to click through these areas. These are just some topics that we wanted to highlight of consequential action recommendations that we anticipate coming out of our subcommittee, where we're still trying to work out the details, and where in our larger matrix you likely saw a number of draft actions that speak to these.
Yes. So again, use value appraisal. We all know that this has been something that, of course, has been talked about for years. So certainly we are no closer to cracking the nut necessarily than anybody else, but we are still trying to come up with some consensus ways that we feel we could elevate some actions that might be helpful, particularly to the legislature. Act 250 is in a similar space. Again, the actions around capacity and economic support for land managers and owners. I was going to say too that some of that, it's very clear there are slides where there are more strategies and less strategies, and that's some of what you're seeing there, is that the group is really working hard to work through that matrix to come to a point where we have achieved consensus to put the language forward. This is also coming up in areas where we're talking about payment for ecosystem services and carbon credit programs, and some of the logistics around that, and how to best how Vermont can approach that in ways that are equitable for the parties involved, and don't where we can create policies that sort of buffer against the worst instincts of some of those market-based approaches. Again, trying to weigh like where regulation is necessary versus incentivizing, and what's most effective, the role of traditional ecological knowledge, the role of electric-led biomass generation is another one that we were spending quite a lot of time on, equity impacts of large-scale hydropower, renewable energy siting, and life cycle greenhouse gas accounting. Just to sort of, I assume those are all cross-cutting issues as well, right, for a lot of the committees. And so wanting to flag that not only are we talking about them a lot in our subcommittee and trying to think, like, get us all on the same page, but I assume they will also be areas that as a full council, we may have some massive overlap in places where they will need to be discussed as well. And I think that does it for us today. We'd rather just kind of open it up and move forward discussing specific concerns from everyone else.
Super. Okay. Thanks, Abby. Thanks, Billy. All right. And there's underlying documents as well. All right. So this is an opportunity to generate some feedback for this subcommittee, and see if we can get some consolidated ideas on the page. Secretary Young, you want to kick it off?
I would. I don't have specific feedback right now. I just am sorting through the matrix that we were provided, and I appreciate the PowerPoint, which really nicely puts it at high level into a few pages. So thank you for that. on these actual spreadsheets that underlie the PowerPoint, I have a question about how they're laid out. And the PowerPoint does show you've done the strategy. And then you've done what is labeled a current action, and it says highlighted where changed. And so there's some green boxes, there's yellow boxes, there's, I just am trying to understand the significance of the spreadsheets and the coloring and what we should be looking for as we read through this. There's a lot here. And just want to make sure I'm understanding what you've laid out in the actual spreadsheet form, which I think is all we've had till today.
Yeah, so, I can speak to that quickly. There is a decision, a consensus decision made by the subcommittee to share the work product as it stood at our deadline. I think there was voices in the subcommittee who were interested in providing kind of a cleaner, more consolidated version without those comments to the council for ease of digestion. But there was a majority of members who felt that if decisions weren't made, if edits were not finalized by the group, that they should still be left open in whatever materials you received. So I apologize for that being complicated and hard to digest, perhaps for those reasons, but that is where we landed. And Abby, I don't know if you want to speak to it, but basically anything that doesn't have a color is kind of in a near final draft perspective. Anything that has some colors are still being worked through by the group.
Great. Do you have a follow-up on that, Secretary Young? Or does that answer your question?
Well, no, I wanted to thank Bill for that, and I appreciate understanding that. I also just wanted to, I think, underscore how this presentation started. And David, going back to your description of the agenda, that these are emerging ideas, emerging pathways. No decisions have been made. They're still works in progress. And I only wanted to underscore that because there is quite a bit of feedback, I think, coming from different people from different members of the public, kind of treating everything that we're doing as a fait accompli, that the council has recommended X. And just for purposes of this public meeting and the public audience, that these are all very much works in progress. And today we're not going to be giving a thumbs up or a thumbs down to any of the subcommittee's presentation, just to make sure I'm accurate on understanding that for clarity's sake, and that folks understand, this is a process and this is not the final product.
Thanks, Secretary Young. That's exactly how I understand it too. So that was well said. And did someone want to jump in?
I
Sorry,
think he was trying to say something, David.
go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say that it's Abby and my hope that we have a kind of final version of that matrix ready again within the next week and a half, and we're happy to share that with the council as an update at that time, if that would be of interest to you all.
Great. Yeah, and obviously council members are always welcome to join in on subcommittee meetings, right? That's always an open invitation. Okay, in terms of, yeah, Jared, were you trying to raise your hand there?
Yeah, if it's okay, just a quick process question. So, for those of us who have questions about some of those either high level pathways or some of the specific actions in the spreadsheet, what would be the recommended process in terms of, can we just email Billy and Abby as co-chairs if we have any feedback? I know that we can't go through all of that today, but if there's some specific stuff, does that make sense in terms of, that landing with you to be shared with the rest of the subcommittee, so we're not emailing the entire committee? Or is there a different process you'd suggest if we have questions or feedback that we're not going to have time to get to today, but that we might want to share that might be beneficial to your process?
I think that question illustrates some of the, I think in theory, I'm fine with that. I think what that sets up is some of the issues that are coming up around the hurdling towards the deadline and all of this feedback that still needs to be incorporated, and just sort of my lack of clarity around how and when that will be happening. But certainly if it's given the okay by the council, it's fine with me for folks to send Billy and I their feedback, and then we can disseminate that to the subcommittee. But I defer to others if there are different perspectives on that.
Thanks. Okay. On that process question, Jane, did you raise your hand on that? Yeah, go ahead, please.
Yeah, so in the process document and the cap drafting timeline that we have laid out, there is an explicit process now for all of these documents as we're simulating them up and beginning to take feedback and take action on them. There is intended to be time at the council meetings for oral comments, of which we'll capture to the best of our ability through our minutes that will be provided to the subcommittees. And then you'll note in the calendar that is out updated on the website, you have 2 days as written for written comments, and they're supposed to be directed to Marion and I for us to assimilate along with the minutes from the meeting to share with the subcommittees on documents.
So that's the strategy, Jared. Coordinate through Jane and Marion so we're not bombarding co-chairs.
That said, I think if anyone has a specific question that is really, they want to get an answer to, I'm happy to hear from them. I'm sure Abby is also. So I think Jane's is the process, but if there's anything really specific you just want an answer to, feel free to reach out, any of you.
Great. Okay. And I will say we have time today, right? So if folks have questions or comments or concerns, we have time today. We've got a half hour right now, or 25 minutes right now to keep going on this. Catherine, you want to go ahead?
Jane partially answered my question because I thought we only had a couple of days to turn it around. And thank you, Secretary Young, for asking that question about what we were looking at, because I was struggling with figuring out and still kind of struggling with figuring out the best way to comment on this set of actions since, and I fully respect where you are, that Billy and Abby noted that this is still a work in progress, and wondering the best approach we should take as counselors to provide that feedback in the next 2 days to help further your process, or should we be waiting until there's another version? But I don't think the timeline allows for that. So I just want a little clarity in that respect.
Yeah. Jane probably is the one who has the clearest vision in her head about sort of the sequence. But I will say where we are right now is providing some initial reaction, and any feedback we think would be helpful for the subcommittee as they are diving into the throes of the next steps of prioritization and getting the matrix in good shape. So this is our opportunity to do that. They're going to come back to us as a council, right, with the product of that exercise of applying the criteria and the prioritization and all that. And so we'll look at that, right? So this isn't our only bite of the apple. This is the first sort of, let's take a look at what's on the table as they're working to finalize. But Jane, do you want to say anything perhaps more specific than that?
No, I just want to appreciate and recognize that, yes, the timeline is very tight, and that's why the documents will hopefully be getting to council members a full week ahead of the meetings where they're discussed. So it's not that 2-day written comment after the council meeting will mean you will have had 9 days with the documents as they are coming to you. The Ag and Ecosystems recognizing the appreciation and moving towards consensus with that subcommittee. Their document went up not till Friday of last week, but you have had rural resiliences since last Tuesday, and that really this meeting in particular is to identify those gaps, red flags, any concerns that you're seeing, or things that you really feel like are missing from the comprehensive body of work at this time to help inform the direction that they take over the next few weeks. And there is time on the schedule for both of these subcommittees to come back to you again with a final prioritized suite of actions and to consider for what will be included in the climate action plan, at which point you will be taking action on those actions for the climate action plan.
Secretary Young.
I think you and Jane both addressed it, but David, you did say this is not your last bite at the apple. And I think that's where perhaps some of us, some of the subcommittee conversation went, the steering committee conversation went previously, which is this is a lot of information for people who have not been on the subcommittee to digest. And we all will have questions. We all have to work through some pretty dense spreadsheets here on two of the subcommittees' work. And I, for one, take some comfort in the fact that this is not a speak now or forever hold your peace moment, is what I'm hearing. That we will have a draft plan, with text, with recommendations that we're all going to have an opportunity to comment on and then use our consensus process before it's put out the door as the state's climate action plan. I just hope that I've got that correct and welcome any feedback on that understanding.
Yep. That sounds right to me. And I welcome Jane and others if they want to correct that. It feels good to me. Catherine and then Joey.
I was ready to move into substantive questions and comments about the actions, but I didn't want to cut off the process discussion if anybody with their hand raised had more on that.
Joey, is your comment about the process or is it getting into the substance?
No, it's more about the process because so thanks, Catherine, for letting me. I guess what would be helpful for me as I'm trying to go through it all, by just appreciating the very thoughtful, thorough work that you've been doing. Just trying to wrap my head around it a little bit better. It may be helpful. I know you haven't gone through the formal sort of prioritization screen and the equity screen, but if there have been conversations around how this work may be stepped and or thoughts at the council subcommittee level about prioritization, how you might wrap your heads around that. I can tell you, as we're tackling the transportation work in my task group, no small feat in and of its own accord. You're tackling something very big and very critical. I'm really relying heavily on the metrics that EIN and the state have in terms of like GHG reductions, and then how do you make those programs that reduce GHG more equitable and that sort of thing. So I feel like we have a little bit of a leg up in that way. It's still a big task, but I just would be curious if have you had conversations about how you might, set the stage for like stepping and or prioritizing if need be.
Abby or Billy, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, I'd defer to Abby on that, I guess. We have, there's been voices that have recommended a kind of narrower breadth of actions. The consensus was to go broad and then narrow. So I think we're kind of at that point, Joey. And, I've had thoughts around readiness, leveraging existing programs, thinking about foundational pieces first. But I don't think the broader group has really settled on anything beyond the matrix that's been provided to us. So I don't know if Abby, you have any thoughts on that?
Nope. I think that's a pretty accurate statement of where we're at.
Okay,
that's helpful. Just sorry, really quickly though, I do want to ask one last question. In your when in the presentation you just offered, there was a new strategy sort of identified in some of them, and I'm just curious, is a new strategy meaning like the other strategies are things that the state is already doing and could be expanded upon, or the new strategies? Can you just clarify what that means? That'd be helpful.
Sorry, again, that was a result of sort of the copying and pasting that was done to try to, we are literally in the midst of all of this work. And so that was a literal, the group identified this as a new strategy last week. And so now it exists as a strategy there. I do apologize. That is, I know, I want to say, I know this is really confusing. I know this is not ideal. Billy and I are doing everything that we can to try to both honor the work, lived experience, and perspective of the group that we have assembled as a subcommittee and work within the confines of the deadline. And this is sort of the end result of
Enjoyed spending time with you today.
factors coming together, I guess, is how I would try to illustrate a little bit better where we are.
Thanks, Abby. Okay, I'm going to go into substance for a little while. And so Catherine, why don't you go ahead with your substantive feedback, and let's try that for a little while.
Sure, and I had to step out for a second, so apologies if you address this in your presentation. I was curious about the actions related to adding climate change considerations into the required agricultural practices and the forestry practices. If you could give some examples of what that might look like, and if there were additional costs to farmers or foresters as a result, how you might address those.
I don't know that we have specifics yet as to what exactly the rewriting potential rewriting of the RAPs would be. I do know that an intense priority of this group is that in whatever ways new things are being expected of farmers, the majority of whom are working under macroeconomic forces for which they have no control, that will be addressed within the equity screening as to how any of those programs are developed and implemented. Aside from that, I don't know that at the moment, and Billy or Lauren, feel free to jump in here, we have a specific thought as to how exactly that will look.
Okay. Billy, did you want to add to that?
No, I think this was not one, this wasn't an area that I was specifically working on, so I don't have a ton to add beyond that.
Great, okay. I'm interested to keep going on substance. So let me just check. I see Jane and Rich and Erica. Of those hands, which want to provide some input on substance? Erica, is that? Yeah. Oh, all of you. Okay. Rich, why don't you go ahead and then we'll do Erica.
Well, I'm going to apologize because I'm going to ask 4 questions. First of all, I want to congratulate the committee for coming up with the 7 pathways and all the work that you've gone through. I mean, I think that's quite extensive and impressive. And as you said, you have some work to do to advance specific ideas underneath those 7 headings. And so my questions kind of go to that. Just quickly, if you have answers to these things, just so we understand better, do you have in mind a specific carbon credit proposal that the committee is likely to make, or is it just, gee, it ought to be possible to get carbon credits for sequestration in soils or forests? That's question 1. Question 2, can you tell us a little more about the debate about use value assessment, and what you're talking about, pros and cons? Just what's the issue that you're focusing on there? Third, biomass electricity as an open topic. I mean, I'm familiar with the usual debates around that. I just wonder whether the committee has highlighted a specific issue or not. And related to that is whether the committee has looked into the question of advanced wood heat pellets manufacture, pellet use in Vermont, wood chip boilers, that kind of thing, because it links certainly to the clean heat standard, and it also links to the viability of working forest land and the forest economy in Vermont. So,
yeah, thank you. Those are great questions. I'll Abby, I'll take a run at some of these and then defer to others too. So I'm not going to take them in your order, if that's okay. Advanced wood heat is certainly we've made an effort to try to separate electric lead biomass from the thermal applications of wood, understanding there's different implications. And I think there's general support for advanced wood heat thermal applications of wood from our subcommittee. And I think we're working on building consensus around finding efficiencies and repurposing existing plants for increased thermal application. So that's definitely something that we're I think generally supportive of. The UVA, the current use conversation is really around the eligibility requirements around management and whether benefits from current use can go to support management practices that are passive or do not produce, that don't have a wood product or a wildlife management component to them, that are focused more around old forests and carbon retention. And there's some science that plays into those considerations, but that's really it, is like how much management would be required to participate in the use value program or some version of it. The carbon credits, that has been a debate really around whether we recommend further exploration of markets outside of the state, or whether there's a development of a in-state offset market. There's existing compliance markets, there's voluntary markets. They all have their pros and cons. There's questions about accountability, things of that nature. We're really wrestling with that as a subcommittee right now. But I think there's a general interest in trying to compensate landowners who own and manage forests and agricultural lands for their carbon value. And exactly what that looks like, I think, is one of the top issues we're focused on right now. And then the last one was, biomass. Maybe I'll pass that one over to you, Abby, if that's okay.
This is not my area of expertise.
We have some members who I think are concerned about the equity associated with large scale biomass and the true carbon costs and benefits associated with electric lead biomass, and whether that is something that's consistent with the goals of the act, I guess is how I would put it.
Public health concerns, et cetera.
Yep.
A quick response. I thank you for all those answers. That was very helpful.
Great. Excellent. Erica.
Thanks, guys. This is really good work, and I'm looking specifically at the strategies relating to increasing flood resilience in the natural and built environment, as well as plan and regulating climate resilience and adaptation, and recognize that there are a number of actions in there that we have talked about previously overlap. There's a natural overlap between our two subcommittee charges, but what I see in there is super promising as it relates to the end product for the plan, because it represents consensus opinions that are really aligned. And those are consensus opinions from subject matter experts in the field so it's really promising. I just have one question about climate resilience zones. We haven't talked about that. And can you guys just expand on what those are and use in the ag and eco world?
Did you say climate resilience loans?
Zones. It's established climate resilience zones informed by existing data, bolstered with new research and science to identify locations that have high resilience potential for both the natural and built environments, and to inform land use development. I think I can infer what it means, but I just wanted to see if either of you could expand on it.
Billy, do you want to let Lauren take that one?
If she's willing.
If she's willing. Look at her. She's like, what are you doing to me?
This is one of the benefits of not being a co-chair, is that you two have to field all of the questions.
Could you let us know what you're referring to as you give feedback? Because there's lots of sections to the spreadsheet. So Erica, where is that?
Sure, I am looking specifically at pathway B. The strategy is plan and regulate for climate resilience and adaptation. And the action original is established climate resilience zones, and it goes on from there.
So that was actually born of a group that Dr. Dupini-Giroux, and I don't know if she's on today, was trying to form through a cross-cutting themes for climate impacts and climate change resilience, recognizing that there is a lot of implications on how and where we both cite renewable energy, where we promote development, whether it's compact or otherwise, the interplay between transmission of energy and it being close to, but also equitable to both rural and urban populations across the state, and recognizing also that we have a lot of data with respect to natural hazards and where areas are more prone to them, and identifying vulnerable populations. That there are a bunch of different data sets that speak to places that humans either should or should not be located or are better served to be located, as well as resources like Vermont Conservation Design that indicate areas that are really important for habitat connectivity in the face of climate change. So I think climate resilient zones, and again, if Leslie Ann's here, and welcome her to jump in, speak to kind of overlaying all of those data and identifying spaces where infrastructure could or should be better placed.
I think you did a really good job in sort of encapsulating that, Lauren, in more from a proactive perspective, so that a lot of these sometimes are current pieces. And I think the thinking behind that was looking ahead, because we're doing this for 2025, 2030, 2050, where are some of those places in the environment, not just from a built environment, not just from a natural environment, but also from the human perspectives, where all of those three pieces come together, especially with migration into the state and migration around the state. How do you think about governance, land use, and all of those different parts of planning coming together in a place that sort of sets up us better than where we are right now?
Okay, thank you. That's fantastic and fascinating. So thank you.
Thanks, Erica. That was great. Jared, go ahead, please.
Thanks, David. So I just want to raise a question on pathway F, actions 36 and 37. And I want to start by saying I am all in favor of the importance of promoting ethical sourcing of materials to the extent possible. I do have concerns that the way that the language is written right now, in terms of not using lithium if it affects specific communities, or not using solar panels if produced in specific places, just a technical logistical concern of our ability to trace supply chains in Vermont, given the complexity of some of these projects. And B, I really wish that there were impact-free energy options, but there aren't. And I think we need to compare our energy choices to the alternatives. And there's no way that we're going to meet our emissions reduction requirements without electric vehicles and without renewable electricity replacing fossil fuel electricity generation. And most EVs at this point use lithium-ion batteries. And the solar panels that are spoken to in 37, in terms of what is being installed either directly in Vermont or what Vermont may be purchasing regionally, it's really difficult to know those supply chains. So I'll just say, again, I support the extent to which we can promote ethical sourcing of materials. I just do not want to see us move forward with bans or very strict language on some of the key technologies that will be needed to get us out of the very ethically compromised position of our continued fossil fuel use and its impacts.
I think what I would offer to that, because I deeply understand the concerns that you're sharing in that regard, is this is one of those things where, Jared, I'm not sure if maybe it might be beneficial for you to come to one of our subcommittee meetings to maybe for us to, directly speak about those issues within the subcommittee structure, or if this is, I think from our subcommittee standpoint, this is one of those areas where I took out the batteries. It didn't work. I got to flip the breaker and I don't have time to step away right now. That's why I'm still tripping. Is where as a component of a just transition, sometimes the best or the only option that you have available to you is to proceed with transparency. And therefore, to your point, there is no impact-free renewable energy, right? But what we do need to try to do, and I think what is of deep and utter importance to members of our subcommittee, is that whatever we're putting forward in regards to our renewable energy attainment moving forward, that it is very clearly laid out the potential impacts and implications for particularly Indigenous communities outside of our borders and within the borders of Vermont. And so I guess that's where I would leave that. I think, we can't fix this, right? This is where we are. And I take your point. I think that the plan will need to reflect the transparency around where we are and what that could potentially mean. Thanks.
Thanks, Abby. Chris?
Yeah, so I may be missing something, and this may come up in another subcommittee, but under the Pathway B, Adaptation, Sustain, Restore, and Enhance Health and Function of Vermont's Natural and Working Lands to help both rural and communities adapt to climate change. We talk about invest in farmland conservation, technical assistance, education, that kind of thing. What I'm not seeing is establish policy to divert development away from working lands, period. Now, I know that may get picked up in the land use cross-cutting area, but I can tell you it costs a hell of a lot more money to try to put in place farmland conservation programs than it does to actually direct development to where every single development policy in the state of Vermont says it should be, which is compact settlement, in and around compact settlement, surrounded by rural countryside. I love that in Vermont we have rural countryside as opposed to that pesky urban countryside, but it seems like we should just start calling that out and having that discussion within the council to see what we can do on that measure.
Thanks, Chris. Abby, Billy, and folks in the subcommittee, is this the essence of that land use cross-cutting conversation that's ongoing?
Yeah, well, I guess I would say when you get down deeper into the actions associated with that strategy B, there's a conversation of kind of statewide planning, regulations, things of that nature. So I think we hit on that a little bit under that pathway, and it does come up again under the land use section. So, I think we had so many different thoughts on this topic. It's maybe the lead's buried a little bit, but it's certainly been something we've been talking about.
Great. Liz, last comment, and then we're going to take a break and come back and do the rural resilience piece.
Oh boy, I hope this is worthy of the last comment. I just want to weigh in on Jared's point and Abby's response, and very much agree that if we're going to, as we should, talk transparently about the impacts of the choices that we have, make certain that we do so with the choices that are currently being offered to Vermonters. And the burdens that creates, not just for the environment and for many, many communities, both here in Vermont and elsewhere in the United States and worldwide, but also the economic burdens that places, especially on Vermonters, since that is our immediate charge, given the costs of fossil fuel and the burdens that places on families, given the context here in Vermont. So I'm wondering if actually that offers a pathway forward, because the concern I had when I looked at pathway F numbers, I think it's 1 and 11 in the summary, which are the same ones Jared was referring to in the larger document, was what would happen if there were a subcommittee pathway that came down to an action that was essentially literally in conflict with a action another subcommittee believed critical for mitigation. And it seems to me that maybe the answer is instead of putting that in a specific action of ag and ecosystems, for example, we just ensure that the council as a whole has a really good section on this issue across all energy uses and sources, so that the voice, the concerns that have been voiced are honored and thoroughly examined for all sources. Just a suggestion.
Thanks, Liz. Okay, great. Okay, I have not been paying much attention to the chat, so I apologize if there's things in there, but we will pull from the chat as well in the summary. So I promised to share my summary notes. Now, we had a lot of questions for the committee and only a few suggestions, but I can share what I've been taking down just as a way to finalize this section. It's a little messy. Let me go to this piece around where the questions started. And this was, I believe, Rich was starting us off. Excuse me, there's an initial thing, and I didn't even catch all the details on this about climate change and forestry and ag practices. I may have the wrong acronym here, so somebody correct me with the right acronym. Then we had a set of questions started off by Rich about, questions for the subcommittee, like specific carbon credit proposal, specifically what we're looking at in current use, specific questions around biomass and advanced wood heat, right? And then some comments about how promising the increasing flood resilience recommendations had. And then some questions about what this climate resilient zones mean, and some answers about that. And then we spent a bunch of time on this, what Liz just left us with as well, right? This ethical materials, sourcing of ethical materials piece. And we had some comments from Jared, from Liz, and some reaction as well from Abby on this, right? So there we actually have some input there to say, this is raising some red flags. Liz offers a pathway to say, what if the subcommittee, what if we had the council as a whole write a good section on this? And apologies, my notes are a little terrible here. And finally, for Chris's final comment about pathway B, not seeing this critical pathway or critical set of actions around establishing policy to avert development away from natural working lands, talking about compact development. Where is that? Will it show up in the land use cross-cutting piece? So those are the kinds of things that I was taking notes on. There's a recording as well, but when we do the notes of the meeting, we're going to consolidate this. We'll make these a little prettier, and this will be what we're putting back to you all for ag and ecosystems to take back with you. Before we go to our break, does anybody want to do a quick fix or correction to what I just scrolled down very quickly in my screen? Anything that was like blatantly terrible in the summary that I'm trying to do here? Okay. Okay, great, folks. Wonderful. So why don't we take a pause? It's just about 3 o'clock. Why don't we take 10 minutes and come back at 3:10? Drop your camera off and go on mute. We'll be back in 10 minutes and we'll do the same thing with rural resilience. All right. Thanks, everybody. See you in 10 minutes. Okay, we're back. I'll give folks a second to get their cameras back on and get back in gear. I took advantage of reading the chat during the break, and I realized that Jane wanted to talk about prioritization before we ended. Apologies, Jane, to that. So let's just, as we're getting going, I'm gonna see if Jane's, looks like she's still getting back on. But let's make sure we give Jane a space to talk about that when she's back and available. Okay, great. So why don't I turn it over to co-chairs from Rural Resilience, I'll let you decide how you want to do this, and the floor is yours, and take it away, please.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm going to share my screen. Hold on a second. Make sure I've got this up so I can share my screen. And hold on. Make sure. Trying to minimize windows here so I can see you all too. All right. Here we go. Can you see that?
It's looking great.
All right, good. Catherine and I are pretty excited to present a roll-up of actions that have been developed by the Rural Resilience and Adaptation Subcommittee. Catherine, I just want to open it up to see if you have any opening remarks, and then I can launch in.
Thank you, Erica. I'll hand it over to you.
We'll move into the next slide. I'll just note that this is a picture of my favorite place in the world, which is Green River Reservoir. So I did change the picture. So as you'll note, those are the members of the subcommittee, as we've talked about before. They are not strangers to this process. At our last subcommittee meeting, knowing that we had this large list of actions that was going in front of the council today, I asked the subcommittee to just take a step back and let Catherine and I know what messages do you want the council to really pick up on in these actions? What is it that high level we wish to really convey to the council about the importance of this work and the body of work that's in front of them? And this slide summarizes their sentiments. One is that climate resilient society is essential to the future of Vermont. It's essential to our health and vitality and well-being. We know that, and we know you all know that, and we're kind of preaching to the choir, but it does underscore the importance and what drives us in our work. We also note that the changes that we are proposing, especially the ones that ultimately become prioritized, are ones that we are going to be set in motion for years, and that we're going to have to live with for years and years and years to come. It's important to note that many of these actions provide a range of both tangible and intangible return on investment. And just because the return on investment is intangible, meaning that you can't really put a dollar figure to it, doesn't diminish its importance. And I urge and challenge you, when you read through the actions, to read through them with that lens. And this subcommittee is made up of it's really a group of people that are practitioners in a field that is impacted every single day by climate change and disasters that are exacerbated by climate change. So adaptation to those events really needs to accelerate, and we are driven by that urgency. These storms and weather patterns are amplified, and they're happening today. They're not happening a few years in advance. Again, I know I'm speaking to the choir here, but we felt it was important to convey a message so that you understood what was driving us as we develop the actions associated with the many pathways that we've presented before. With that being said, our process to date has, once we received feedback from the council on the language around our pathways and strategies, we finalized that language, and then we worked toward developing goals for 2025, 2030, and 2050. From that point on, we really focused our energy into streamlining and consolidating and articulating actions that are action oriented. We've recognized that we have some work to still do to make sure that the actions are outcome oriented, so that they really can stand on their own and can convey what the intended outcome is. You don't just have to follow the breadcrumbs of a pathway to a strategy to the action. If you read the action, you would understand that what the intended outcome is. And we still have a little bit of work to do to get there, as well as streamlining and making sure that we're not duplicating across pathways. But what you have in front of you is really, I think you get a picture of the direction that we're looking to go in terms of resilience and adaptation. And then, of course, we held the Rural Community Stakeholder Engagement event, which was an online event. And Chris Campany is looking at us through his binoculars, and this. Sorry, squirrel, Chris Campany. So we had our stakeholder engagement event, and that was really illuminating, really well done, really good conversation. We recognized, or at least I am coming to find that through our engagement, we're actually getting a lot more validation of some of the actions that we have drafted from the public, which is really good because, again, it represents consensus opinion. It's also allowing us to tweak our actions where they need to be tweaked. So just a reminder, I'm not going to read through these. We have 5 broad pathways that cover broad areas, including local and state capacity, infrastructure, municipal GHG emissions, as we were charged to do in the GWSA, land use, and housing. These really encompass the extremely broad scope of what it means to be climate resilient in Vermont. So with that, we're going to launch in, and the way we're going to kind of format this is we have 5 pathways. Catherine and I are going to kind of talk through, summarize the actions that you have in the spreadsheet that was provided to you. And then we're going to open it up after each pathway for some more in-depth discussion or to answer any questions that folks might have. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Catherine. You're on mute.
No, I'm not. Thank you, Erica, and also thank you to you and Marion and all of our task group leads to get us to the point where we are today. So Pathway 1 really focuses on the capacity of local jurisdictions, community networks, state agencies, and a host of other entities like civic groups to support and implement climate adaptation. The actions associated with the strategies really speak to establishing permanent funding streams for environmental planners, developing a state level individual assistance program to help people after a disaster strikes, increasing outreach and training to get to sections of our communities that currently aren't involved in this work, and developing toolkits to provide communities with multiple options to build resilience. Actions associated with this pathway really underscore the resource needs at the local and the state level to be able to accomplish all of the goals we've laid out in the eventual climate action plan. And with that, I will see if anybody had any questions or comments on the actions that were associated with pathway number 1.
I'll just note that in the spreadsheet, you'll have kind of your home page that looks at the pathways and strategies. And then if you click through the tabs really highlight where the actions are, actions associated with each strategy.
Great. So you'd like to do some clarifying questions on each strategy and then, or each pathway, excuse me, and then at the end we can do a consolidated set of questions. That's great.
If that works for you as facilitator, sure.
Sounds great. Sounds great. Any clarifying questions folks have? Just quick reactions as you're seeing this pathway in front of you, or as you read it ahead of time. Sue, go ahead, please.
I hope you can hear me.
Yes.
I am so excited about all of this work and thank you very, very much. I feel like it hasn't really been dug into very deeply and comprehensively before now, so I'm very appreciative. On item 3 under pathway 1, these are high level, so I just wanted to know if we have sort of actions that we anticipate or imagine around sort of this cross-sector collaboration piece, or are we just at this high level and we're going to explore that as we proceed?
Are you looking at
looking at the slide on, yeah, what I can see is, I guess, strategy number 3 under pathway 1.
Sure.
Expand cross-cut.
Catherine, did you want to summarize the actions under?
Sure. So we do have some associated actions related to that strategy, and they're in the spreadsheet that was attached to the agenda.
Got it. I will go further exploring. Thanks.
That's fine. But some of the, I'm trying to pull up the spreadsheet now to look at the examples.
I've got it in front of me, Catherine.
Okay, there it is. Yeah, I've got it too. Okay, go ahead.
So this is one, some of these actions are really drawn from what our charge was in the GWSA. And so some of the actions include identifying and developing necessary programs to address threats posed by drought and infrequent snowfall, as well as irregular what did we change that to?
Sugaring season, yeah.
Sugaring season. Also developing statewide climate change impact assessment for the commercial sector. So really understanding how a consolidated resource on climate change and these events impact on especially on the commercial sector, including the ski and sugaring industry. And then also compiling a composite map of existing town zoning statewide with the purpose of being able to have a better understanding in one place of the different zoning regulations that are in place town by town. That'll help in further decision-making down the line.
Super, thanks. Chris?
On pathway 1, so great job. I'm thrilled that you guys included the remote meeting discussion for any number of reasons, but I mean, I think that's modernizing that whole process. I think is going to be critical to effective public engagement. Under the share best practices and idea support activities and increase citizen awareness of climate resilience and build community cohesion. One of the things that it strikes me in Vermont, I think it's a challenge because of our media market and just how public outreach has changed. Like when we have, Hurricane Awareness Week or Tornado Awareness Week or whatever it is that we need people to be aware of. If we could just develop a more cohesive and effective strategy to get word out, not only on building on what exists out there, but and maybe this is something where VEM and the RPCs could really work together to come up with effective strategies to push information out and awareness and frankly preparedness. And it doesn't just have to be the traditional, hurricanes, tornadoes, other things. It could be other topics or issues, but I know that's a really specific action, but it just seems like something that would be increasingly effective and critical and probably very cost effective. And I was going to share a quick example. Sometimes when I used to listen to Mississippi State baseball games on radio, like no less than probably 10 times during a broadcast, they would have the Mississippi State baseball coach talking to kids saying, "Hey kids, do you have your tornado preparedness plan? Has your family discussed it? Do you know where to meet up in the event a tornado separates you, yada, yada, yada." And I love that it's targeted to kids and it gets the kids thinking about this, so they talk to the parents and actually come up with a plan. Mm-hmm. But that's a real specific, real life-threatening issue down there. But it's hard here because we don't necessarily have, maybe it's broadcast of UVM hockey games or high school football games or other things, but I mean, that level of kind of thinking through how do you effectively communicate with the general public about this stuff. But anyway.
Yeah, thanks for that, Chris. And I remember that was also an issue that we talked a lot about when we were working, and Erica remembers too, on the state hazard mitigation plan, is how to really develop these methods of communication and excitement and interest that are accessible to all people, regardless of any access barriers. So I appreciate that comment, and we'll definitely add that to our list.
Great. Okay. Sue, go ahead, please.
I apologize if I'm not able to get to the right spreadsheet, but one question I have, and it may come up later, is whether this work might involve, we all know that we have tremendous challenges in this state for a number of reasons, but I think very acutely under this frame of decisions, no county government and the need to be able to break our state down into jurisdictions. And I'm just wondering, and I know Secretary Flynn and I talked about this oh so many years ago. Is there any thought, have you guys given any thought to unifying jurisdictions in some way so that we have consistency? It certainly we can live without the consistency when we're dealing with things other than disasters, but some consistent jurisdictional map of the state. I'm just wondering if we got to that question at all in your deliberations.
That has not come up yet.
We can take that back for comment and discussion at the subcommittee level, though.
Great, thanks.
Can I just...
Okay, shall we move on to the next one? And we'll have time to circle back once we've seen them all and have some further reflections.
Thanks. So we'll move on to pathway 2. So this pathway is all about infrastructure that is important to sustaining our quality of life as the climate changes year after year. We have already acknowledged our obligation to redouble our work to build resilience to climate change. And this is really where the rubber meets the road in a lot of ways. Actions within this pathway include reworking the way that we identify, assess, and protect our infrastructure around the state. The subcommittee also pointed out that modernization and streamlining of permitting for projects that are important to resilience, the necessity of grid modernization and prioritizing upgrades that maybe shorter should not fall to ratepayers, but should be done anyway to support the eventual common goal of better resilience. The team also points out the importance of deployment of foundational technology to support smart grids, which will support overall resilience as well. Coordinating transportation, communications, and electrical projects to the greatest extent possible to ensure resilience alternatives are also in use. And also identifying mission critical facilities that in order for us to target investment and ensure resources like emergency shelters, emergency services, grocery stores, mission critical facilities that are critical to the continued service of a community and may not have previously been considered critical infrastructure, that these are identified and targeted for investment and hardening so that they are still operating in disasters. Preparedness actions can also be taken with infrastructure operators to ensure that they are ready to respond efficiently and in a coordinated fashion. This can be somewhat inconsistent around the state, especially when you look at the size of some of our critical infrastructure operators. The task group that compiled these actions really spent a lot of time talking about and emphasizing the importance of the grid to the reliability of our infrastructure in the future. So we really wanted to hone in on that point. With that, I'll open it up for discussion. You'd be on Pathway 2 tab on the spreadsheet to take a look at the actions that were compiled by that group.
Thanks, folks. Any reactions? Again, in the spreadsheet, there's a whole host of actions on this one. And so that detail is there. And I don't know if anybody would want to ask some questions about the overall strategies or any of the detail in the actions. Chris, yeah, go ahead.
Do you, I may have missed it. Do you guys get into housing, rural housing?
Yes, in
And
pathway.
there's, yeah, path, we have a whole housing pathway.
Also, okay.
Great.
We can go on.
Before we, oh, June.
Oh, go ahead, June.
And Anne has been so helpful, and Margolis, I should note that before you
Oh,
speak.
yeah. Oh, yes.
I'm so very pleased to hear that and not at all surprised. David, and not that it matters, but I can't seem to turn my camera on. I have no question. I just wanted to comment that I'm very pleased to see the recognition in this pathway of the, I don't know, it's an English word, criticality of communications resiliency and specifically broadband connectivity. This is good news, and I really appreciated the recognition that not all of these costs properly fall to ratepayers. These are societal costs as well. So that's all I wanted to say.
Thanks, Commissioner.
And before we move on, I wanted to call people's attention to one action that's one of my favorites that might get buried because it's small and short. But we have an action that I haven't heard mentioned before in any of the task groups, which is to consider the strategic abandonment or removal of vulnerable, non-critical infrastructure. And I just wanted to call people's attention to it because it's short and it's a very small line, but if done, the impact could be great. So the idea behind this is that we don't perhaps need to spend $500,000 to repair every culvert that gets washed out if there's a couple of other alternatives to get people to the same place. That's just one example. But given everything we need to do, we need to, I think, recognize that there is potential that we can't do everything.
Great.
Sorry, Erica, thought that was important to highlight.
No, ma'am. All right, we'll move on to pathway 3.
So in pathway 3, as directed in the Global Warming Solutions Act, the subcommittee outlined a number of actions to get a better handle on where emissions are occurring at the municipal level, and using that data to expand access to programs like weatherizations for homes, businesses, and municipal buildings. Other actions include expanding access to upgrades of residential electrical service, electrifying municipal fleet vehicles, and that was something we heard at the community meeting that we had. Encourage net zero water and wastewater treatment facilities, and funding a tariffed on-bill finance pilot of all electrical utilities.
All right. It was interesting, Catherine, the last time when you sort of pulled out an action you thought the council would be particularly interested to know about. Are there any on this bundle of actions that you'd want to really call people's attention to?
There's some pretty specific one about providing a grant to households to upgrade their electrical systems. So that's a very specific and targeted action that I think would be good to pay attention to. And then I would just note that, you know, our task group did a great job of putting this together, but we recognize this one in particular is a bit of a work in progress because we do really need to build on the cross-sector work of the cross-sector mitigation teamwork to see where we can pull out some rural best practices.
Great. Secretary Moore?
Yeah, I just, the Catherine, flagging the one about the grants to homeowners to change out their electrical services, it's sort of a bigger question about approach to some of these, where I think the substance of that, like the need to upgrade electrical services in homes, is a really important one. Grants would be one way to do it. A time of transfer requirement might be another way to do it. And I just wonder, maybe broadly for all of the subcommittees to think about sort of the outcome we're looking for and then the pathway to achieving it, and just to the extent it's possible, separate those two, because I think that outcome is really important. And it gets back to some of the conversation we had early on about sort of modifying and being able to support or not support different actions within the plan, and separating the mechanism from the outcome may be an important component in thinking about how to sort of prioritize the actions that will be most impactful overall.
Yeah, that's a good point. And we definitely recognize we've got we need to tweak the language to make it more outcome oriented, so that again they can stand on their own.
Thanks, Rich.
I think I'm echoing the point just made, but I'll put a finer point on it. It seems to me that to integrate these ideas with the ideas coming out of cross-sector, we might adopt a policy or recommend a policy, something like make these grants available to homeowners to upgrade electrical capacity in order to link to electrification of vehicles, or the installation of cold climate heat pumps. In other words, or as part of a weatherization project, in other words, link it to a package of actions, not just, hey, here's some money to upgrade your electric service.
Yeah, I think that's great. That's great feedback. And that's what we're hoping to do, especially in this pathway, is to evolve these to mesh with the cross-sector mitigation work.
Right. Liz?
Huge appreciation for this work. It's directly relevant to what we're doing in cross-sector and literally going to be a part of that package. On that last point, it's, I think, to pick up on the conversation, it's not, I think the suggestion could be not just grants, but grants and other tools to permit homeowners and businesses to afford. And so getting to Secretary Moore's point, I think, even if grants across the board were not found to be the highest best use of money that is available for all individuals, it might be a really good path for some, while low interest loans or packaging with tier 3 incentives or other programs might be appropriate and better suited, better use of dollars for others. So I think if I'm picking up on that, that's maybe a suggestion to broaden that way of presenting that one in a way that I think would capture what you're looking for.
Great.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Great. Anything else on this pathway? Okay. Shall we?
Yes. So Pathway 4 is all about land use and contains several cross-cutting actions that are currently being coordinated with a cross-subcommittee group with ag and ecosystems. And this is where I found that we really are seeing some emerging consensus opinions about the actions that are necessary, which is really good in terms of the ultimate outcome, which is the climate action plan. This move would, so perhaps one of the largest policy discussions in this pathway is regarding the statewide land use plan. This would consolidate the various land use regulations in place at the local level, but obviously poses challenges of local control. The subcommittee has discussed this at length and feels that it's important that if transformative change is to be seen related to, if transformative change is to be seen related to adaptation and climate change, that this is one of the moves that's important to that. Another important piece of this pathway is a series of actions related to establishing a permanent state level funding source for hazard mitigation projects. This funding would not only fund projects that are ineligible for FEMA programs, but would provide the non-federal match in certain circumstances for FEMA hazard mitigation projects. This is a crucial step to reduce the barriers to entry to programs that deliver a 7-to-1 return on investment, according to the National Institute for Building Sciences. This means for every dollar of investment into mitigating flood hazards, on average, $7 of damage costs are avoided. Again, transformative change requires that we invest at the state level on a permanent basis and not rely on federal programs that may or may not reflect the needs of Vermonters. Finally, there are a number of actions to support investment in infrastructure that specifically supports compact development that is resilient to climate change. Actions include climate readiness assessments of drinking water, stormwater, and wastewater infrastructure, a number around drinking water source stability, and the consideration of adoption of statewide residential building codes. So a lot here, a lot in the land use realm, and certainly a lot that we're still discussing quite a bit. I recognize that there's subcommittee recognizes there's a lot of mixed opinions, which is why it's important to bring it to the council for discussion.
Okay, so this is a meaty one, folks. What do we want to say right now about this? What questions or input do we have? Commissioner Turney?
Again, just feedback. It's outstanding work. I commend the committee. This is really thoughtful and tends toward the practical and inevitable, frankly. So I congratulate the committee.
Great, thanks. Sue?
Yeah, I echo the commissioner's sentiment. I love seeing so much of this all pulled together. One question, even as we develop some sort of a funding to either complement or advance hazard mitigation projects. Another thing I've thought a lot about and have seen effective is when we actually prioritize existing state project grant programs around a particular goal, and that hazard mitigation be considered a priority for our planning grants, our land use related grant opportunities.
I think what I'm hearing, Sue, you saying, just to maybe rephrase that, is to incorporate resilience considerations into those existing grant programs.
Not just considerations, but prioritization.
Yeah, okay. Thank
so
you.
that you get more points when we're scoring all these applications for those kinds of proposals.
Understood, thanks.
So how far would you go with that? Would you go so far as say, let's say Northern Border Regional Commission grants, which really focus on job creation? Would you give extra points to those who also include adaptation or resilience considerations?
I think there's a lot that we can do to advance the ball. If we think about even priority areas where there's high vulnerability, so if we overlay, where do we have high risks? And we can actually put a lot of the grants incorporate, therefore, resilience. There may be areas of the state where it isn't as important as it is in others. But I've certainly seen everything from, CDBG to MPGs and all the AOT grants. When you put them all together, I mean, that's kind of some of what we were able to do after Irene. We put a lot of state prioritization in key areas. So that would be my thought.
Okay, thanks.
Excellent. Chris?
Yeah, I don't know how far we can go or willing to go, but I'll put this out there. So I love the increased investment in infrastructure, of course. I'm just wondering if we can also talk about, especially since we're talking rural resilience, we need grants, not financing. And also I would just suggest, just like we did with the Clean Water Initiative, we really need an all-in approach. If it's the state's primary policy, land use policy goal is to achieve compact settlement. I know we're getting into housing here in a minute. It seems like we need to quit relying on federal pass-through dollars and invest more as Vermonters in making sure that compact settlement can happen. because I can tell you for practice, one of the barriers is, first trying to rely on the people who live in compact settlements now to fund infrastructure investment. And then it's really challenging for town. The first question they have is, how do we pay for it? We should make that conversation easier so that they even want to have it in the first place. The other thing I'll just throw out is I like that you guys looked at the building code to recognize location efficiency. I'm a big advocate of actually doing like physical planning and design of what our compact settlements might look like, where they are, like where housing is best suited in commercial, and how to do that, keeping new development out of harm's way, especially river corridors and floodplains. But on the building code, on the energy code, I'll just make a pitch again. I like that we have an energy code, but buildings are systems, and I would just say that to make buildings more resilient, period, you really need building codes that look at grading and sediment erosion control, that look at structures, that look at plumbing and gas, that look at electrical. I think I said structures already. And there's research done by FEMA and others, I think Brookings Institute, that shows that in communities where you have building codes, not just energy efficiency codes, of course, but actual building codes, resilience and recovery are much stronger than communities where you don't have that. And I think I know that that's not the Vermont tradition, but I think there are ways that we could figure this out. And this gets to the governance issue about what level of government is it most appropriate to have that work. And I've got some ideas about it, but
Chris, we do have an action that recommends that states to consider the statewide building code. So there is an action under strategy B, I believe, that does that. It's action number 32 on pathway 4 tab.
Oh, awesome. Thank you. Great.
Yes.
Sorry, I didn't have a chance to look ahead of time. I apologize.
Oh, no, that's okay. I can't understand that you haven't memorized everything that we got in advance of the meeting already.
Okay, excellent. All right. Joey, go ahead, please.
Okay, thank you. Yes, just wanted to echo folks' appreciation for this work. And as I noted, see very many overlaps with the cross sector. So look forward to digging in. If you already talked about this, please excuse me, but I'm curious if you can speak a little bit more to one of your pathway 4 strategies related to creating an Office of Strategic Investment and Coordination that supports the achievement of land use planning goals. We had recommended something earlier on-ish in the transportation work, looking at a statewide planning office or something like that. Yours is a much more interesting and appropriate, and I think opportunistic name, but I'm curious if you can speak to that. And I think we'd very much look forward to working with you on that concept.
I think there's, so when you look at this and also you look at the overlap with the state land use plan, I think there's a number. Also, I also recognize that there's some actions in ag and eco around an office, interagency office of climate to ensure the coordinated implementation of resilience projects and things like that. I think you're hearing an echoing pattern where there's kind of a state level office that's allowing for more coordination and potentially, consolidation of regulation around a number of these items. So this is one thought. I can't really speak to any more than because we're not the subject matter experts on every single one of these actions.
Great. Okay. We've got 5 minutes.
All
How
right.
are we doing?
We're doing great. We'll move on to pathway number 5. So this pathway is related to housing because as we've stated before, we all recognize that without a solid base of housing, access to housing that's affordable, that's energy efficient, then we don't have strong, resilient communities. We don't have a strong economy. You can keep going forever on how important housing is. So we have here this pathway related to housing and a number of associated strategies. Some samples of actions that are included in this pathway include modernizing the zoning statute to include mandatory and optional provisions to increase housing options and improve resiliency, to expand an existing pilot program to support a network of local builders that can design and build the small homes or accessory dwelling units, otherwise known as mother-in-law apartments in the old vernacular, in communities with regulations that welcome housing. So if you welcome housing, perhaps you get some more assistance to get that housing built. And then finally, to create a rental registry, an inspection program to improve housing quality and safety, and to increase funding for community-based homelessness prevention and rapid rehousing. So those are some examples of the actions related to this pathway.
Great. Okay. Thumbs up from Chris. What else? Any reactions or feedback for this group on where they're landing on housing? Tricky issue, we know. Great.
I'm gonna stop
Okay.
reading, so for more overarching discussion.
Great. Abby and then Rich.
Thanks. I apologize if you covered this while I was gone. I got a call from the school that my son did not, in fact, have an after-school program, and I had to go get him. So I'm wondering, did schools come up anywhere in this? And I'm just wondering if they have been framed out in terms of community resilience. I know that folks have a hard time with this in the framework of climate, but again, with resilient community structures and thinking about compact development and things like that, school policy, I assume, will need to come into some of our thinking on this at some point. And so I just wondered if maybe we could think about how to ensure that that is in there in terms of thinking about resilient communities, particularly in rural frameworks, when you're thinking about the impacts of climate change moving forward. I know that that's all over the place, but that's a thought that popped into my head. Thanks.
Yeah, and I think that's a great comment. And if you have when you have a chance to ruminate on that more, when you didn't just rush back from your last minute pickup, if you have any suggestions related to that, like, which pathway it might fit under best, and something a little bit more, I think we'd be really interested in hearing it.
Okay. And to be clear, we have not had a directive conversation around schools, how many schools are necessary for certain size communities in the, we really had to, I'm not saying we purposely left them out, but we really had to try and focus our attention. But that's not to say that that's not an element that should at some point here be incorporated. So we'll bring that feedback back to the committee.
Great. Rich?
Well, 2 points. One is that there, in a really positive way, there are really good cross connections to some of the buildings work that cross sector is doing.
Oh, that's good.
So that's good. And one in particular, the idea of a building code for rental units is one of the recommendations coming out of cross sector with respect to energy consumption of buildings. And a second is more kind of a generic observation. And I didn't see that you had called it out, maybe you did. As we've discussed before, there is some tension in Vermont between village center development, historic development patterns, and hazard mitigation concerning floodways. Mm-hmm. And that needs to be reconciled on a place-by-place basis, I assume. I think that's really just requires careful planning place by place and probably needs to be called out.
Yeah, there are actions that talk about considering strategic abandonment. There are actions about hardening current flood vulnerable infrastructure. And you're right, it is something that the subcommittee has discussed, especially around land use and strategically either protecting some of those resources and or depending on what it is, relocating them. But you're right, it's a place by place consideration, and it can be very tricky. There's not a one size fits all solution for those items.
Right, and new development can be strategically located adjacent to or in conjunction with existing development patterns, and support compactness without overloading the floodplain.
Right. We got to have time for a few more. Secretary Young, and then Chris, and then we'll finish up.
I'm all set. I'll cede my time. I think I just answered my own question. Thank you.
Great. Chris?
Yeah, quickly, Rich, I just want to respond to your comment. There is a strategy and there's an action in there that talks about doing, community by community vulnerability assessments, to determine where our areas are safe and where do we want to make investments and where do we want to, abandon, but also a need to look upstream and downstream for opportunities to restore floodplain, to protect our existing settled areas. I think it'll be a hard conversation to ask communities to walk away from, hundreds of years of investment in infrastructure and community life. But I think we can take some small steps, definitely to improve their safety going forward.
And to not exacerbate the problem.
Yeah.
With each new build.
Thank you.
Leslie Ann, go ahead, please.
David, I might have missed this, but could you tell me if any of the conversations included human health, public health pieces? I'm just thinking ahead to some of the ways in which Jay Schaefer and I are going to be writing up part of the intro pieces around climate change and the physical parts of that, and including heat waves and all of those other pieces that speak directly to human beings.
Need to find it. We have been talking about specifically heat islands and development patterns to reduce heat islands, and I just can't find where that is.
Yeah, there disease vectors. There was tree planting programs. Chris Campany had recommended, communities looking at how they can make plans to, set up cooling centers quickly when the need is. How to ensure that buildings, that have air conditioners, so when we have bad air quality days, that people can live inside with their windows closed and not suffer from the heat. So yes, there's several different strategies in there.
I think what you're seeing is that we don't have a specific public health strategy where those are consolidated. So when you asked the question, I thought, I know they're in there and I just have to find them. And so maybe that's something we need to think about, is how if there's a way to organize those and so that they're not buried.
Right. Maybe thinking about it from an all hazards perspective and sort of including non-water. So moving beyond floods and droughts and thinking of it to include all of the hazards as we know are coming down the pike.
Yeah.
That's really helpful. Okay. So let's do what we did last time real quick. I don't know if this is how helpful this is or not. Let me just try to share my screen.
While you're doing that, I would just like to say that all of these questions and comments have been really great. And I think we'll just add to our work and make it better.
I also want to thank the subcommittee members for their work on this. The way that we have approached developing the actions related to these pathways is we've divided the subcommittee up into task groups by pathway. Some folks are on multiple pathway task groups, and they have really solid ownership of those actions. And as we move into prioritization as well as revision of some of the actions, they're going to continue to have that ownership. And they've worked really hard on this, and they've been fantastic.
That's great. Okay, just to show you what the notes I'm taking. For some reason, my document just froze as well, so hopefully this works.
David, it's not frozen on our side, but I'll just note that Dr. Drew has her hand up.
Oh, sorry, Leslie, did I miss another hand?
Old hand going down.
Okay, great, thank you. All right. Okay, pathway 1, we heard talk about questions about the cross-sector collaboration actions, and indeed they're there. We had some questions in comments about getting information out. And this question about, have you thought about breaking down into jurisdictions with some consistency in the face of emergencies and disasters? In pathway 2, a shout out, thanks for focusing on communication, assets, and broadband, and continuity around that. On pathway 3, this conversation we had about separating the outcome from the method, and we talked specifically about the upgrade electrical systems, that maybe grants will work in some places, maybe other tools in others. And also at the end of the day, package these things up. So, excuse me, link them to a package of actions coming out of other subcommittees, whether it's around weatherization or the energy profile of homes, et cetera. Pathway 4, again, some more congratulations coming out. A request to think about scoring of existing programs and inserting resilience more aggressively into that. And a shout out on building codes. And indeed, there are action items on building codes, I think under pathway 2, but I might have gotten that wrong. But a shout out that more comprehensive building codes are part of the story. And an interest to work with you on the strategic coordination piece of your action plan. And then in pathway 5, a question around schools. And a request, Abby, it's always dangerous to bring something up because then someone will ask something of you. But yes, suggestions welcome on how to incorporate schools in this. Some nice crossover, what's happening in cross sector around building codes for rental units. This tension around historic settlement patterns and floodplains, really challenging, probably needs to be more emphasis on place-to-place approach with the mix of things that you all talked about there. I grabbed this from the chat as one of the few things I pulled out of the chat, just because it was a very clear request around Firewise Communities program. And then the final piece about human health, public health. This is where my computer froze. And then pull that out, thinking about hazards beyond water and being very clear about that so it's not as buried. Okay. Those are the notes that I took heading back to the subcommittee. Other things that folks want a quick shout out, Liz?
Yeah, I think the notes capture the detail, but the kind of gratitude or whatever that I and others expressed for this work, I don't want to just not capture that in the notes because I think it's a pretty practical comment. When I saw this set of recommendations and the way it had been put together, in particular because of some of the stuff, that intersects with the electric sector, I thought, aha, this is how the plan can come together. In other words, it's not just working with cross-sector or other subcommittees, including some of the ag and ecosystem stuff we talked about in the last hour. It really is putting it all together. So it might make the drafting a little bit more challenging, but there's so many things in here that really are directly relevant and coordinating with other pathways and other subcommittees. I just want to make sure that's captured somehow so that when the drafting happens, we're less in silos by subcommittee and more in here's a comprehensive path forward that includes much of what this presentation today from both subcommittees raised.
Thanks, Liz. That's really helpful. Jared and Secretary Young, and then we'll pivot to our next item.
Very much on the same theme as what Liz was just saying. I thought I was saving time by putting it in the chat rather than saying it in the full meeting, but I do think it's worth specifically noting how close and well aligned Pathway 3 Strategy B that was presented is regarding weatherization and electrical upgrades is with the work of the cross-sector mitigation subcommittee, especially the buildings task group, and that might be an area where when we're noting a lot of the cross-cutting themes and how, you know, some of the resilience and mitigation measures in this case are complementary for a special kind of elevation and highlight.
Thanks, Jared. Secretary Young?
Yeah, I'll just close out and thank both of the subcommittees for some excellent work. While we'll have plenty of discussions and probably disagreements about particular things, just getting all this on paper feels good. And what struck me about the presentation, to echo what Liz has said, or to add to what Liz has said, is I really liked that I could tell whether we were creating something new, adding to something that's existing, because one of our charges is to create an inventory of existing strategies. And so reading through this with the action items was just really helpful, told me right away whether we're doing something new or adding to an existing program. So I just wanted to share that.
That's great. Yeah. Okay. Excellent. All right. Well, we did it. And what an amazing tour de force of all the work that's been done. We've got one more substantive thing we want to do on the agenda, and that is these definitions for cost effectiveness and feasibility. I think we're still good to go to do that. And I wonder, last time we did this, you know, Jared, you as a co-chair of science and data, you helped us do this. Do you want to walk us through what's happened and what's being put forward here today? What we're asking for agreement on?
Yeah, David, this is TJ, I think.
Oh, TJ, you're gonna
even though Jared was on the agenda, I think, but I think it was always planned for me to present this time as the other co-chair, so I can walk through it. And yeah, as you noted, David, at the last Climate Council meeting, the Science and Data Subcommittee was requested to provide some definitions for two terms, the technical feasibility and cost effectiveness. We discussed those requests at the subsequent Science and Data Committee and had a task group assigned, which met and then discussed again. And the full committee has now recommended these definitions that I'll pull up in just a minute. I will note that it was a quick process, less than a week for all of that to happen. But you know, there's time reserved on tomorrow's Science and Data Committee meeting if there are changes. So I don't have a presentation, but I'm just going to pull up the recommended definitions here that you all got in the materials for today's meeting. Can folks see my screen now? Yeah. Okay, so I'll start with technological feasibility. On this one, we really largely adopted a term that was defined in the IPCC report with one modification. I think that was a recommendation to look towards the IPCC for guidance here, which we did. Essentially, technological feasibility, we recommend defining it as the degree to which the required technologies are developed and reasonably available. The modification to the IPCC definition is the addition of the word reasonably, and that as Science and Data intended to put some limitation around what might be available, distinguish what might be available in theory, but what might not be practically available in Vermont. So at the risk of causing debate, I'm going to suggest think about something like a non-ag related carbon capture and sequestration. So like capturing something from a natural gas generator and sequestering it in the land. That may be technically possible, but not really reasonable in Vermont. That's kind of an extreme example, but without going into too much detail on that example, I just wanted to give an idea of what we're thinking. And then below the definition here in the summary, we wanted to give a little color onto what we considered. And we did consider a broader definition, but didn't find it appropriate to include something that was more expansive. Feasibility is actually a separate definition articulated by the IPCC, but we didn't think it'd be helpful in a practical way. That definition really, if we just use feasibility, it could include a broad group of items that like human behavior or political feasibility that would really just be difficult for counselors to evaluate, or it could include other items like just transitions issues or cost effectiveness, which are separate prioritization considerations. So we talked about that and considered it, and then went to this narrow definition of technological feasibility. So I want to, that's it for that definition. I'll stop there, and before we get into cost effectiveness, see if there's questions or comments, or Jared, you could provide more color if I missed anything.
Thanks, TJ. Okay, so today, this is where we're actually asking for the council, you all, to adopt these definitions so that all the subcommittees are working with similar definitions as you're doing this analysis on the 5 foundational criteria, of which 2 are these. So this is a moment where you as a council will be asked to adopt. So let's have some conversation about this for a second. And then we'll do this exercise of, are we understanding this? Are we adopting this for the purposes of our analysis of our draft strategies and actions as we head into December 1st? So quick, let's do some clarifying questions for understanding, and then we can move forward figuring out if we can all live with these definitions. Secretary Young?
Would you please remind us what the 5 foundational criteria are so that we can be thinking about these in context?
Yep, Jane's got that great slide with the pie on it. So it's these 2, cost effectiveness and feasibility. There's just the equity, which is the sort of just transitions exercise. There's impact, which is how much this action gets you towards the goals of the Global Warming Solutions Act, or the goals that the subcommittees on resilience and ag and ecosystems come up with. And then there is, Jane, what's number 5? Co-benefits. Co-benefits. How much you're able to, with one action or set of actions, deal with multiple of our goals here as a council. Those are the 5. And there's that nice slide that Jane has.
I really appreciate that. I think it's important to have those all on the table, because that tells me that by not including them in this definition, they may or will be included, for instance, in just transitions when we're talking about equity, eradicating poverty, and the like. Am I thinking about that correctly?
Yes, that's our understanding. We didn't want to complicate it by having feasibility include some of that in a different prioritizational criteria.
Great. That's a great clarification. Jane, is that you with a hand up in the conference room?
Yeah. I just want to acknowledge, as TJ continues to present the definitions for technical feasibility and cost effectiveness, that there's been some parallel work done over the course of the last few days, informed by previous presentations to the council on foundational criteria and the recognition and appreciation of how we'll advance using them in prioritization of our actions. And so I just want to suggest that very detailed guidance around how we take the 5 foundational criteria, use a stepwise approach in order to elevate high priority actions to further advance with respect to equity, with the support of Kaya Morris as our equity consultant over the course of the next few weeks. We'll go out to subcommittees and council members later this afternoon, informed by this conversation with all of you around these 2 explicit definitions. But I do just want to clarify that the guidance for the prioritization will build upon the definitions that you adopt today for cost effectiveness, and for cost effectiveness specifically. not for technical feasibility, because for cost effectiveness in the realm of how we utilize it to prioritize, we needed to take it a step further in order to elevate what would be significant, like significantly cost effective, moderately, and low. And so I just want to recognize and appreciate that there will be some clarifying language built into prioritization that will, I believe, based on my conversations with science and data, will just go to inform and clarify the definitions that you're seeking to utilize and approve today. But just want to put that out there that they may appear different, but I believe that they're in line. And so that conversation will happen at the subcommittees later this week around explicit guidance on prioritization, and then the timeline for how we expect to elevate the high priority actions for development with Kaya Morris and others in the equity screening, and how we'll all come together to come back to the council later this month.
Okay. Okay, great. Are there questions or doubts about the way this feasibility language was put together in science and data? Okay, great. So let's just go forward to the cost effectiveness, and then we'll have a nice moment where we say, yep, we're using these, let's move forward with these definitions, assuming we're actually in agreement on them. TJ, you want to move forward to the cost effective one, please?
Okay, yep, I should be sharing my screen again. So for cost effectiveness, the short definition is really costs per desired outcome. And so, and the long piece of it is a lot of explanation to go with what we mean by that. We give an example here, past the underline here, but that for purposes of mitigation measures, this would be cost effective or cost, net lifetime cost per ton of lifetime greenhouse gas emissions avoided. But the Science and Data Committee only provided an example that was related to greenhouse gas mitigation, because that's really what was a clear definition to us. And we didn't feel like we had the expertise to provide an example for adaptation or resilience in terms of cost per what is the desired outcome. So in terms of cost effectiveness for the different subcommittees, that means it's actually a slightly different definition for each subcommittee, although it falls under the framework of cost per desired outcome. Now, we also wanted to give a little guidance on, how to measure cost, because cost can be counted a lot of different ways. So we put in this guidance on a primary benefit cost analysis, which is effectively a Vermont resource cost test plus externalities. And so where benefits and costs really should be inclusive of the direct and indirect benefits and costs to, and this is important, to Vermont and Vermonters. And so that would include program implementation and management costs, which really include, I think, regulatory costs, for instance, like if there's a new regulation that doesn't necessarily have zero cost, somebody's got to manage that, but really total cost to Vermont. More importantly, perhaps the benefit side should really estimate the social and environmental externalities, which probably most notably include health impacts, and then also a social cost of carbon valuation, which reflects the recommendations that we presented in August on the social cost of carbon. So if you scroll down, there's another note here too, though, but when you think about it, and this where it may get a little less clear, is that in a lot of circumstances, when you're thinking about a policy or a proposal, that additional benefit cost test really may be appropriate for analyzing, for your analysis. For instance, a customer test, or that customer impact some policies could really increase costs for customers, and that could be appropriate information to understand as you're determining whether this is a good policy, or from a public investment perspective. And so, the recommendation from the Science and Data Committee is primarily use this Vermont resource cost test plus externalities, but also be mindful of these other impacts and other ways, perspectives to look at it. But that said, the recommendation for the definition, just to go back, is really cost per desired outcome.
Okay, thanks, TJ. Really helpful, complex, and yet this document tries to do a good job of synthesizing this down, a set of definitions that will be useful for us. Okay, any questions or concerns for TJ in Science and Data about these two definitions, the cost effectiveness in particular, because we haven't talked about that? Yeah. Absolutely. We're definitely going to leave time for public comment. Yes. So folks, here we go. Catherine, then Joey, then Sue. Let's try to be brief on this. We've got a bunch of folks lined up for public comment too.
I'll note Erica was unable to get back into the meeting because the participant limit was exceeded already. So I'm just passing that along for her, unfortunately. And so on behalf of both of us, I will let you know that we have some question about how to apply this cost effectiveness approach. And TJ, you alluded to that in the adaptation and resilience arena. And I'm not sure how to be supportive of this definition without understanding how it will then be applied to and used in our work.
Right. So, we didn't feel like we, like I said, had the expertise to say exactly what it is you'd be measuring for cost effectiveness in the resilience subcommittee. So, it was difficult for us to kind of come up with a metric. Originally we had just discussed, hey, it's cost per avoided ton of carbon dioxide equivalent. And really that was really just focused on one aspect of what the Global Warming Solutions Act, is about. So I'm afraid I don't have great guidance for you. Honestly, it kind of punts it to back to your committee to come up with what is really that desired outcome. And then here's how you as you look at the costs, and it could be savings actually. So the costs and benefits per whatever that desired outcome is. And then I think, as Jane alluded to earlier, there would be there's kind of some follow-on guidance that I think she's going to provide today or tomorrow that will kind of give you a sense of a high, medium, low type rubric. But it's probably not the most clarity. I apologize for that, but
David, this is Jane. I just, sorry that I can't figure out how to raise my hand, but I do just want to suggest that in absence of clear definition for cost effectiveness for specific to resilience, adaptation, sequestration, and storage, we have proposed one in the prioritization guidance that will go out today that again builds upon TJ specifically to this and then creates the parameters for what high, medium, and low would be. And I look forward to sharing that with everybody and then discussing it in detail with the subcommittees this week.
So would then the approach be I think we are expected to endorse this today, but it sounds like that piece is missing. So would we be asked to endorse it minus that piece, which would then come back to the council? How does that all fit together?
Yeah, I honestly started to think through this with TJ and Jared in anticipation of this meeting just today, and recognizing that this will go out to the subcommittees in the essence of time today, and prioritization needs to start as soon as possible. I expect to bring it up and add it to the agenda for the steering committee meeting tomorrow to just refine and ensure that there's broad support by the council on the definitions we're proposing using, since they're so important for how we're going to prioritize and elevate the actions that carry into the climate action plan.
Yeah. Okay. Let's get a few more comments and then let's figure out what we want to do with this. It sounds like the basics feel right, and this detail is what we're looking for when it comes to rural resilience and ag and ecosystem. Okay. Joey?
All right, I'll try to be very brief because I do want to get to the public comment period, but I guess my question, and I can take it offline or explore it further, is how Vermont or how we calculate externalities, because it seems to me that the cost of the externalities that we are bearing has increased, will increase. So how do we respond to that increased cost from, like, safe infrastructure or investments that we're going to need to be making from more intense weather events, that sort of thing. So it's just more of a process question for how that externality calculation is addressed over time.
Yep. Sue?
I feel like there's a lot to consider here, and I'm thinking a lot about equity considerations and how differently costs are allocated and impacted across disparate groups, income just being one of them, and how we think about that, if not try to include it in some definition. I guess I'm not feeling ready to embrace this particular definition yet. And I'd like to talk about it with my subcommittee as well. I'm sorry. Thank you.
For the cost effectiveness one? Yeah. And the feasibility one, Sue?
Yeah, I'm more ready on that, I guess.
Got it. Okay.
I will note that the Science and Data Committee did discuss whether to include equity in this discussion, or in this definition, excuse me, and kind of fell back to that equity and just transitions was another one of the foundational criteria, another piece of the pie in the pie chart, and explicitly didn't include it here. And then on Joey's comment, I just will say, I think it's a really good question. I think there's values for some externalities that are readily available and not for others. And I think that's going to be a challenge for each subcommittee. And hopefully there's a recommendation eventually comes forward that there's other areas where we need more information for new iterations of the climate action plan.
Great. So this is what I'm hearing, folks. Let me just test something with everybody. Let's split these up for a second. And in the feasibility piece that we talked about first, are there any concerns with moving forward in the subcommittees with the definition as put forward in the document today? Are there any concerns folks have with the feasibility? Let's set cost effectiveness off for 1 second, but the feasibility definition, any concerns for folks about that and using that in the subcommittees starting now as they're heading into the
technical feasibility? I think that's an important clarification, David.
Yep. Exactly. Just that's well said, Liz. It's laid out as technical feasibility. That's the essence of that definition. Yeah. Any concerns about that? Okay, so I'm not hearing or seeing concerns from folks here. So let's say that with that definition, we're comfortable moving forward as a council saying, yep, subcommittees, that's our focus on feasibility. Okay, cost effectiveness. I'm hearing a variety of concerns, and I want to test real quick. And we can even do this in the chat or some other way. Is it fair to say that we are in a place where we're looking for some more detail on two issues in particular, the ag and ecosystem and rural resilience piece, the resilience and adaptation piece, and how that's going to play out, how we are going to be doing externalities, and how sort of the distribution of costs figures into this and the interplay with just transitions. Those are three issues I heard people want some more information on. So I'm not sure we're in a position to say double thumbs up here on cost effectiveness. I'm sensing that we need to see Jane's additional guidance, and then push that back up. And we're going to have another council meeting right around the corner to look at this. It's frustrating that we're moving into prioritization right now. But I'm not sure what else to do with all the concerns that were raised in terms of people feeling not so comfortable.
Is there, David, is there a specific, when I hear that, I'm not sure if there's a specific ask of the Science and Data Committee. We have a meeting scheduled tomorrow and could put this on the agenda, but I'm not sure exactly where we could take it, or if there's further information that the council wants us to think about as a committee.
Yeah. I would say for those who express concerns, like I mentioned, the 3 levels of concern. One is it's kind of pushing things back to rural resilience and ag and ecosystem on how to do this with adaptation and resilience issues. So I don't know, Catherine or others, are you looking for more guidance from science and data? Or are you comfortable saying, nope, we'll take that on as a subcommittee? Then there's the issue of externalities. Is there anything else to do right now? Or is we just have to say, this is as much as we can do? And then the third piece that Sue brought up about sort of how does the distribution of costs work into this? So if you're folks that brought those up, do you have a specific request for the science and data subcommittee that would make you feel more comfortable moving forward?
David, if I might, I
Yeah.
do think that the prioritization guidance is the next step, only because I think that the clarifications and the that we've proposed collectively through the work with the council in the past and what I put forward gets at the points that you're making. So I do appreciate tabling cost effectiveness, and I'm more than happy to review those with science and data tomorrow, recognizing they were tasked with defining cost effectiveness, and then bring it back to the full council next week.
Thanks, Jane. Does that seem like an appropriate next step for the council on this? Okay. All right. So here what we're doing is we're saying okay to the feasibility definition. We're saying Jane's going to work with science and data on some of these concerns on the cost effectiveness and provide some more detail. And we'll circle back with you all as council as soon as our next meeting. Okay. Commissioner Attorney, and then let's pivot to the next thing.
I just want to make a general observation here, which is I appreciate that we're trying to get buy-in across the board here. I don't feel that we have sufficiently noted the degree of research that this committee did in order to come up with these definitions. And I'm worried that we are not showing each other sufficient deference. We organized committees around expertise with members who have expertise because we recognize that there's a limit to what we can do with democratized process with a council that has 23 members and the incredible short amount of time we have to do this work. So I would just urge those who are taking issue with these definitions and are teasing out these implications to consider the degree to which we can continue to spend time on this and whether there's perhaps an opportunity here to proceed in good faith, because these folks have done a lot of work, just as you did a lot of work on the things that you've reported to this committee today. I'm very concerned that we are aspiring to a level of perfection in process and buy-in that is unrealistic for our task at hand. Thank you.
Thanks, Commissioner. Okay. All right. So unless I hear otherwise, Jane in the subcommittee will provide a little bit more detail based on what we've been talking about. This will circle back to the council, and Commissioner Attorney's comments are well noted as well, that there will be a limit as far as we can get on these kinds of issues. Okay, great. Thanks, everybody. Jane, do you want to say a word about what's going on, this updates, and then we can do 10 minutes of public comment as promised? Jane, you're on mute if you're trying to talk. So while Jane sorts out the audio, I know she's trying to do multiple things there in the room. The update that she wanted to give is just emphasize that public meetings have been happening across the state. They've been well attended. I hope some of you have been able to get out to some of those. And they are ongoing. The website is a great place with information about them. And it's exciting to be out talking to Vermonters about this. There's also been stakeholder meetings online. So there's been a lot of activity. Jane, are you back online here and want to say anything more about that?
I am.
Okay. Your signal's
I
a
don't know
little
if I
weak.
have that we're good to move to public comment. Yeah, what I was suggesting is I have a weak signal and that it sounds like you did a comment on it. So thank you for doing that. And I appreciate just moving to public comment.
Thanks. Commissioner Turney, is that a new hand or an old hand? Sorry. Old. Okay, great. Okay, so I understand we've got two places with public folks who want to do public comment. Where Jane is in the conference room, I understand there's some folks there who are interested in doing public comment. And then online, we may have some people who are interested in public comment. And I just want to quick test the waters on the numbers of folks we're dealing with here who would be interested in making a comment today. So if you're online with us on the Zoom call, if you could raise your hand in the Zoom, if you'd like to make a public comment today, that would be helpful. And then Jane, if you could give a signal to me somehow in the chat or just verbally about how many folks in the room there are interested in making a comment, that way we'll have a sense of what we have in terms of numbers today.
Thanks, David. Marianne's managing the room now, so she'll speak up.
Okay, Marianne, yeah.
Just one comment together from the room. I put it in the chat.
Okay, great. Well, why don't we start in the room in person with whoever wants to comment. Just introduce yourself, please, and go ahead and let's try to keep these to about a 2-minute. And I'll just give you a heads up as we're getting to those 2 minutes, just so we can share the floor well today with your colleagues who also want to comment. So go ahead, please. You want to introduce yourself?
Hello, Climate Council members. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. I'm here with 350 Vermont to deliver you a few postcards. My name is Marisa Keller. I've lived in Vermont all my life, and I intend to live here until I die. These Green Mountains are my home, and these days, every turn of the season is more precious to me because I know that none of it is guaranteed anymore with climate change. But as far as I'm concerned, Vermont's future is my future, no matter what comes. And I'm here to ask you to build that future with compassion and vision and courage, because what you do, the work you are doing matters. I grew up believing that what I did didn't matter so much. I wasn't good at winning arguments or chatting with just anyone. The idea of knocking on doors and talking to strangers makes me anxious. And that's what I thought politics was. And so I figured it was better if I left it to other people. But throughout my 20s, as I watched the climate crisis worsen and our country get more and more divided, as I watched my friends who were politically active get burnt out and discouraged, I realized that I could no longer tolerate standing by. So I think we all recognize that we're at a crossroads. We know that the climate crisis will get worse, but we also know that our actions hugely matter to how much worse it will get. We need to transform our society. It's an incredible challenge and an incredible opportunity. This summer, I had the privilege to be editor of 350 Vermont's newest climate justice zine, Grounded. The stories we gathered gave me a glimpse of how Vermonters are already prioritizing human and ecological health over business as usual. I learned about how the Montpelier Parks Department is growing food for the city's seniors, about a CSA farm and cultural center for BIPOC folks in Brattleboro, about planting trees to mitigate heat sickness, about people using their free time to manage invasive species and plant pollinator gardens, and also incorporate anti-racism and Indigenous wisdom into their lives. That's the future I want for myself and my state, and your support is essential to making it happen on a larger scale. I'm here today with my own story, but I'm also here as the voice of 2,795 Vermonters who signed postcards in support of the People's Climate Action Plan for a Just Transition, as well as 188 Vermonters who joined our community meetings around the state. We are delivering their comments as well and ask you to read them and listen to what they have to say. Can every member of the public on this call who is in support of a People's Climate Action Plan raise their hand, either physically or digitally? I know many folks have also renamed themselves PCAP to show their support. Thank you. We are encouraged by the incredible work that the council has been doing on such a tight timeline, and we want you to know that we are with you. We are asking you to put your weight behind meaningful climate action that serves families, workers, farmers, ecosystems, and communities, especially low-income and BIPOC communities. Last week, I met someone who recently moved to Vermont, and he said to me in a tone of amazement, "Vermonters care." From regular old town meetings and green up days to big events, big disasters like Tropical Storm Irene and the pandemic, we show up to care for each other, just like you all are showing up to do the essential work of creating us a climate plan. Vermont may not have unlimited dollars, but I know that we have the resources we need to bring about real solutions. On behalf of 2,795 postcard signers, as well as everyone else in Vermont whose future depends on this plan, which, to be clear, is all of us, I'm asking you to set us on a path toward a truly just transition. I look forward to seeing a climate action plan that provides for all Vermonters to thrive. Thank you.
Thank you, Marissa. Thanks so much. Thanks for coming in person. Thanks for delivering those postcards. I really appreciate that. And the tech seemed to work okay, that we heard you very well.
My colleague, Catherine Bach, is also going to speak to the postcards, and it would be great if she could go next. She's
okay. Great.
Thank you.
Thanks, Marissa. And so I am happy to tee up Catherine next. A lot of you raised your hands when Marissa told you to say who supports this this climate plan. And I'll ask, if you don't want to speak, to please go ahead and put your hands down so I get a sense of how many folks actually want to speak. Thank you for doing that. So let me turn it over to Catherine, and apologies, I'm saying your name wrong. Is it Catherine Bach?
Yes.
Okay. Go ahead, Catherine, and we'll try to keep it around in that sort of 2-minute mark so that everyone can get a chance who wants to speak today.
Okay, I will try. Thank you so much for allowing me to speak. My name is Catherine Bach. I live in Charlotte. I'd like to tell you why I'm here and what we are asking for specifically. And I have to start by saying that I've been listening for a while. I'm really happy that you were discussing equity and a just transition. As a child, I spent most of my free time in nature. The plants and animals were like my best friends, who I felt closely connected with. They brought me great joy and support in facing the challenges of a childhood as an immigrant in America. In 8th grade, I read Rachel Carson's book, Silent Spring. The fact that humans were spraying poisons that killed animals filled me with fear and anger. But even more so was this feeling that the grown-ups who were supposed to protect me were ruining the world. How many kids feel like this today? And what are we, the grown-ups, doing to protect them? I spent the last 60 years taking action. In the last month, I was one of the people collecting signatures from my neighbors and everybody I met to ask that you work for a just transition away from fossil fuels. Most people eagerly agreed with the asks on the card. It's clear they don't just want to get rid of fossil fuels. They care about who benefits and who loses. They want to make sure we use this opportunity to make everyone's lives better. Today, I'm asking you to listen to them and join them, and to be the grown-ups all the kids need us to be by developing a climate action plan. And I was going to read all of the asks, but I think it takes a lot of time and you have them on the cards.
Yeah.
So I just want to say again that it's really heartbreaking to hear children speak of climate change and not feel like that we're protected and that we can do something about it. And so having a climate council that is considering all these things is a great gift. And we're just asking you to take your part. Thank you.
Thank you, Catherine, so much. And indeed, we do have all those cards, and they will come into the record of this. And as we mentioned at the top of the call, the Just Transition Subcommittee is looking at ways of lifting up the work of those who are going around the state talking about climate right now. I see George Gross and then Scott. So go ahead, George, please.
Good afternoon. Thank you for this opportunity to address the Climate Council. I'd like to circle back to the earlier conversations we had on the ag and ecosystem recommendations to the council. I first start by asking a question. Sort of, most of my activity with the Climate Council has been the Science Data Committee, and in that realm, we've been looking at greenhouse gas emission rates for many different types of energy use, but not as much so for the land use. And a key question I think we have to address is what's the carbon dioxide sequestration rate of our forests per year, per acre, for unmanaged forest land that is actually in its natural state? Because that sets the benchmark that quantifies the societal cost of any land use change that we might propose, whether it be installing solar panels or doing housing development or any other endeavor that we consider important in our societal needs. That damage, in other words, the delta between the carbon sequestration rate we had and the rate that we have after the land use change, that must be quantified and as a societal cost and subtracted really from the benefit that the project might have in its review process, whether it be a permitting of an energy facility in front of the PUC, or perhaps Act 250 proceeding. In other words, the forest sequestration rates we have are a public good that should be held in trust for our children. They should not be monetized as carbon offsets, because candidly, this is a common path for enabling corporate business as usual practices to cloak their fossil fuel emissions. And I would recommend from this perspective that the ag and ecosystems work is really about land use policy, and that all land use changes from unmanaged forests to some other activity is inherently a potential step backwards from achieving our emissions goals. With that said, I think it's a very slippery slope to quantify and monetize our natural resources, and in particular, Vermont's forests, which are the crown jewel of our land. With that said, I hope that the ag and ecosystems work comes in with a recommendation to not monetize our forests, because frankly, the track record for that type of endeavor has very checkered progress across the globe if you were to look at it. Thank you.
Thank you, George. Appreciate those comments. Scott, you're up next. Scott Zenz. There you go.
Thank you very much for allowing me to speak to the Climate Council. My name is Scott Zenz. I live in Thetford Center. And yeah, I have family who this summer made it through the heat dome in the West. But neighbors did die out there. And here in Vermont, many of my neighbors are involved with agriculture in different ways and have already seen strong impacts on their livelihood. Working with the energy committee in town, I know how difficult it is for programs that come through the state to affect lower income members of our communities. Most of the programs that have been put forward so far have benefited people who make more than the median income in the state. And when Sue Minter raised that question about equity in the distribution of costs across the population, it really rang home for me. We not only have to consider those people who are currently having a hard time getting, their basic needs met in the state, but we really have a generational equity issue as well. In order for any of these policies that we are crafting here, that you are taking the responsibility for crafting, in order for any of them to get implemented, we will need to have bold funding mechanisms that do not kick the can down the road to future generations. I think that this is important in cost effectiveness. This is important when we consider the feasibility, and this is a very strong ethical problem that we need to solve in the state. I think that the strength of the conversations that I have been witness to are just a very small portion, but encouraging, because Vermonters really are going to be behind you if you put together programs that are just, that really make it possible for all Vermonters to lower their carbon footprint and not see really onerous, expensive upgrades that they can't afford. I appreciate your work, and I hope that you are going to be listening to. Really, now we're in the thousands of Vermonters that want to see a just transition for the people of Vermont.
Thanks, Scott. Appreciate those words. Great. Well, we had a lot of powerful words here at the end in our public comment. I really want to thank everybody who showed up for that. And thanks, counselors, for going over allotted time in our agenda so we can listen and see that. Okay. Thanks, everybody. I'm not seeing additional hands for public comment. Let's pivot to our next steps in finishing up our meeting. We are in a fast pace of meetings. We've got another council meeting next week and the following week. We are moving fast, and we'll be looking at cross-sector strategies and actions, just like we looked at the other two subcommittees today. We'll look at that next week. Jane or others, are there next steps that we need to say right now before we close up this meeting?
Nope, just that we also have a steering committee meeting at 8 tomorrow morning. So
yes, fast and furious. Okay, fantastic. All right, folks, thanks for all the attention. It's hard to do this on Zoom for so many hours. Really appreciate it. We're going to try to be as efficient as possible in these meetings and give time to the things that need the time. We'll see you in a week, if not sooner. Thanks for all the work in the subcommittees. Take care, everybody. Have a great rest of your afternoon. Appreciate all the time today.
Bye. Thanks, everyone.
Take care.
Thanks, David.